It's 10:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. I'm Charlie Pelletan. This Bloomberg Business Flash is brought to you by Wells Fargo Advisors. Consider Wells Fargo Advisors Financial Network, where you can run your business with true independence supported by unrivaled resources. Learn more at WFA.com/resources. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all advancing right now. We have got the S&P up 50, 57.63, a gain of 0.9%. We are looking at the best level of the session so far on the S&P, with the Dow up 344 now, up 0.8%. NASDAQ up 176, a gain there of 1%. 10-year 4.36%, the 2-year 4.22%. Gold lower little change, down $1 the ounce to $27.35, and West Texas Intermediate crude by 1.1% higher now, 72.26 for a barrel of WTI. Again, 10-year 4.36%. So, election day, how are investors positioned for potential outcomes? Gennady Goldberg is head of U.S. rate strategy at TD Securities, and he was a guest this morning on Bloomberg Surveillance.
Really what I'm hearing from clients is that they'd rather react to the election results than try to position for them and actually take that risk, because there's just too much uncertainty in both sides. So I think there's a lot of folks waiting to regroup. There's a lot of cash just sitting on the sidelines waiting. And either way, I think people will be happy to get some of that uncertainty out of the way.
Goldberg was interviewed this morning on Bloomberg Surveillance. You can hear more of the interview on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcast. Palantir Technology shares surging now, up by 21.1% on record profit and high demand for its artificial intelligence software. For on-demand news, 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pelletan. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Charlie Pelletan, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Emily Graffeo, sitting in for Alex Steele on Paul Sweeney Live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. We're streaming live on YouTube as well. You know that Palantir news that Charlie was just reporting? You know what analyst nailed that was Dan Ives. I mean, he came out with a super bullish initiation of coverage, I don't know, 6-12 months ago, and called it, he's huge, one of his biggest AI plays out there. Stock just ripped, so it was a nice call there, again, by Dan Ives. Let's get back to this election here. Henrietta Trez has been a valued source for us, all things politics here for a long time. We appreciate getting a few minutes of her time. She's a managing partner and director of economic policy at Veda Partners. Henrietta, we've got early votes. Is there anything we can glean from early voting? And if so, which states should we kind of look at?
Yeah, we do have early votes. I think there's really only 2 states that I'd feel comfortable saying are giving us strong indications right now. And they're both very promising for Donald Trump, I think, in Nevada and in North Carolina. The early vote turnout, the Get Out the Vote initiative that the Trump campaign has embraced this year, unlike the last cycle, is really for in-person early voting. And both states have done that in droves. And we're seeing that sort of nationwide in all the early voting. A lot of rural Republican voters have turned out at much larger numbers than we saw either in 2022 or in 2020. So his supporters are definitely getting the email and the memo about getting out there early.
So does that change your forecast at all for who actually is going to win the Electoral College? Because if I'm reading the notes, your most recent forecast was that President or Vice President Harris would actually win the Electoral College.
That's right. So the early vote is telling me that the Electoral College map that I have pathed out for each candidate is still holding strong and looks correct. So I expect Donald Trump to win Nevada. I expect Donald Trump to win North Carolina and Georgia. The last 2 are pickups. Arizona, Georgia, and Nevada are all pickups for Donald Trump this year that I'm expecting, and that's what early voting is showing. There's a lot of different opinion out there. John Ralston, who is excellent in Nevada, is saying that Kamala Harris is going to win by 0.3% in Nevada. And of course, Democrats have eked out wins in the state of Nevada for the last 2 cycles. And that's based off of sort of the legacy of the Harry Reid machine. And Jackie Rosen continues to pull well ahead of her competitor in the state at the Senate level. What you're seeing in Nevada and Arizona is actually that 15% of the Republican constituency in those 2 states are voting for the Democratic Senate candidate. So if there's crossover that early vote can't pick up, I don't know how you voted. I just know that you did vote. If there's crossover amongst Republicans into the Harris camp, that is that's going to be a surprise that is not registered either in the polls, which are finding everything sort of neck and neck. And it's not going to be something that we know from the early vote because we don't know how you voted. So that could be a shift that we see on election night. But my expectation is that they both go for Trump. But overarchingly, I still anticipate that Harris will win Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, and that gets her 270 electoral college votes. And that's why my odds are 60% that she will win.
Interesting. Henrietta, we had a poll come out in the last couple of days from the state of Iowa. That was surprising for a lot of people, showing that Vice President Harris leading in that state, which typically is a Republican state. What did you make of that poll, and what does that tell you?
It really reinforces the story of this election cycle. There's been a tremendous amount of focus on the Black and Latino youth vote, and specifically the youth male vote, and how there's been a draw away from the Democratic Party and towards the Republican Party. What I think that whole conversation has missed is that the story of elections is really the suburbs. The suburbs vote the most. They are the arbiters of the election cycle. So in 2016, they swung 4 points for Donald Trump. In 2020, they swung 2 points for Joe Biden, and they decided the outcome of the election. Right now, in critical states like Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the Philadelphia suburbs are going strongly for Kamala Harris. And so the story of the Seltzer poll, I thought was fascinating, that 23% of the Iowa voters in the suburbs, plus 23 for Kamala Harris. That's an indicator that the suburb story is correct, and I think we can translate that nationwide. I don't expect Kamala Harris to win Iowa, but the story of the suburbs is what I really want to focus on when I see that poll and then transcribe to swing states.
How have each candidates kind of catered towards that suburban vote? Are there certain issues that you studied that resonate more with the suburban voters that the candidates have been, I guess, trying to touch on?
Democracy, this concept of democracy being on the ballot is a really big deal in the suburbs. They think that issue is critical. And then beyond that, you have abortion that Democrats try to hammer home. And on the right, you have immigration. It's really those top three issues. The economy is important, but it's such a misleading or misguiding polling question these days, because your view of the economy is mostly defined by whether you support Joe Biden or Donald Trump. Biden's administration or Trump on the campaign trail. So if you side with either of those two parties, that dictates your view of how the economy is going. I think now that inflation has been tamped down and gas prices are back well below their 2022 levels and are down now to $3 or less nationwide on average, it's a opportunity for the two campaigns to talk about other issues besides just the economy. And we see abortion, immigration leading, and then democracy in these suburbs is really critical.
Henrietta, some are suggesting that we may not know the winner of the presidential race for days. Isn't that in and of itself a problem for the U.S.? Shouldn't our country, with our technology, be able to know almost in real time kind of how the voting's going? I just don't understand why it feels like our system is so antiquated.
I completely agree, and I think it's a great point to make right now. Why can't we start counting ballots the second that they start coming in? I think that's a little frustrating. So you have a state like Pennsylvania where all these poll workers, and they have so many this year that are, really doing the Lord's work. They're, they're early, they're expanding voting hours, and they are, ready to put those ballots through the machine to have them read. We should definitely be capable of starting that early. They had the opportunity in the last couple of years with all these different refinements in the ballot process and collecting and changing of laws, like we've seen in Georgia, for example. They're going to start reporting out different county data at 8 p.m., which is going to be one of our first arbiters of how the night is going. But I completely agree. I wish they could move this along.
Yep, interesting. I'm sure some kid in a garage out in Palo Alto could come up with an app in a day. Henrietta Trez, thank you so much for joining us. Henrietta has been so helpful to us during this whole election process. She's a managing partner and director of economic policy at Veda Partners. She is down there in New Orleans, I believe, Louisiana is where she's based. Coming up, David Paleologos. He's at Suffolk University. He's a director of the Political Research Center there. We'll get his thoughts on this election. That's coming up in just a moment. Stocks still trading higher. S&P 500. That's up about 0.9%. Dow up 350 points. That's 0.8%. NASDAQ a solid 200 points. 1.1%. Stocks trading higher. This is Bloomberg. Good morning.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Emily Gaffredo sitting in for Alex Steele. I'm Paul Sweeney. We're live here from our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio in New York City to our worldwide audience, streaming live on YouTube as well. All right, swing states. Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Arizona, Nevada. Do we just look at the states, or do we drill down even more to maybe local towns or local counties and to see how this thing is going to go? I have no idea, but our next guest does. David Paleologos, director of the Political Research Center at Suffolk University, joining us from Boston, Mass, via that Zoom thing. David, again, we know the swing states. Do you go even more granular to look at certain parts of the state, certain towns? How do you do it?
Yeah, we do, and we've gone mainstream with the bellwether model. Of the bellwethers are areas that correctly predict where the statewide vote is going to go. I just tweeted a list in the swing states of what counties or cities to take a look at. But the first three states that you mentioned, Paul, are really the ground zero: Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. According to a lot of the aggregator models, they have Georgia, Arizona, and North Carolina tacking toward Trump. So that puts a lot more pressure on those three Rust Belt states. And within those states, we're looking at specific counties, as you say.
And what makes a county worthy of an extra eye? I know that you've written Northampton, Erie in Pennsylvania, Kent in Michigan. What specifically about those counties makes them worthy of watching so closely?
So it's a proprietary model, but generally speaking, what we look for is, does the county flip when the state flips, or vice versa, from Democrat to Republican back to Democrat, A, and B, when it does flip, does the county vote as close to perfect accurately reflect what the actual percentages were when the flip happened? So it has to not only just flip, it can't flip 60-40 and it'll be a 2% flip on the state. It has to be, if it flips and it shows a candidate winning by 3 or 4, the state should show the same. So, and there are a bunch of other indices that we use in our screening process. But those counties, when you're watching tonight and you're hovering your mouse over the map and you're looking at your own sort of prediction of how the states are going to vote, Northampton and Erie have been remarkably prescient in terms of predicting the statewide outcomes in Pennsylvania, as has Kent and Door County in Michigan and Wisconsin, respectively.
David, our last guest had their prediction, I guess Harris 270 electoral votes, Trump 268. Do you guys at Suffolk have a similar type of prediction, or are you not in that business?
So we don't model. We do poll, and we give our information out to the public, and it's consumed by aggregators like Nate Silver and 538 and Charlie Cook and Larry Sabato.
Yep.
And they take our information with others, and they run their own models. But it's a really close race, you know, and I can tell you that just by virtue of polling some of these bellwether areas. And what I'll be looking at, though, is maybe a little bit different. I'm going to be looking at New Hampshire first off, because we're going to get New Hampshire numbers fairly quickly, and it's got an evenly balanced party affiliation. And in Biden won on New Hampshire in 2020 by 7.5 points. Kamala Harris wins by between 6 and 9 points. No need to worry about New Hampshire. But if she wins by 12 or 10 in New Hampshire, that signals to me that independents who really make up the undecideds are swinging blue, and you could see that reverberate across the country. If Harris only wins by 1, 2, or 3, or loses New Hampshire, I think the opposite could be true. You could see Trump carrying in some of those other states. So I'm going to keep a little bit of an eye on New Hampshire and how those results are coming in. And I've also listed a couple of the bellwether towns in New Hampshire. Hampton is one of them, and Jaffrey, New Hampshire.
I know it's so hard to tell right now, but what is your sense for just how long the counting is going to take and how many days we'll have to wait to see when these results come out?
Maybe I'm just an optimist, but I think we're going to be pleasantly surprised. I think there's a lot of trust in our national poll of local precinct warden. People have a lot of trust in their own local community's ability to process and count votes. And I think they don't want to lose that trust. And so I think they're taking great pains to try and improve the efficiency of their own operations. They improved a little bit in 2022. I think they'll do a little bit better. I hope it doesn't carry on for days and weeks. And I think, I think we're going to have at least due diligence on the part of the counting process as best we can. So I'm hopeful that it will only be a day tops or two, not weeks.
David, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate getting your perspective. David Paleologos, Director of the Political Research Center at Suffolk University. Again, they're one of the sources for a lot of this polling data for the folks that are in the business of making predictions. So we'll see how it goes. But again, the message has been very clear. Too close to call here. So I'll be interested to see how the networks handle it this evening in terms of kind of what we've been, I kind of grew up with, you kind of knew this stuff by 9 or 10 o'clock and networks were making the call, and I'm not sure we're in that environment this year.
It's so interesting to see just how carefully these pollsters and these, I guess, data scientists zoom in to counties. It's just really incredible.
And what's also incredible is, I don't know, we'll have to see how accurate they are or not coming forward. We've got some green on the screen. We'll check in with Abigail Doolittle in just a moment to get the latest on what's happening with these equity markets. But they are higher. S&P 500 up 44 points. That's about 0.8%. We're going to have more coming up. This is Bloomberg. Good morning.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney.
The real outperformance has been the U.S. corporate high yield.
Are the companies lean enough? Have they trimmed all the fat?
The semiconductor business is a really cyclical business.
Breaking market headlines and corporate news from across the globe.
Do investors...
My question is, who are your most trusted advisors today? Is it Ted and Todd? Is it Greg and Ajit? Is it your wife, your children? And what do you value about them? Thank you.
Well, it depends whether they're advising me on money or on other things. I trust my children and my wife totally, but that doesn't mean I ask them what stocks to buy. I was, in terms of managing money, there wasn't anybody better in the world to talk to for, many, many decades than Charlie. And that doesn't mean I didn't talk to other people. But if I didn't think I could do it myself, I wouldn't have done it. To some extent, I talk to myself on investments. I think my children have gotten a whole lot wiser over the years, and so I listen to them on a lot of things. I'll listen to my daughter on who to vote for locally because she knows a lot more about that than I do, and I'll listen to my wife on a lot of things, and I won't get into details. So it is important. I mean, you don't live a life where you surround yourself and limit yourself to people you trust. It won't be much fun. I mean, I literally have been in the position ever since I was in my 20s of being able to have people I trusted around me, and I've made mistakes occasionally, but they filter out over time. You learn, and when I found Charlie, for example, in all kinds of matters, not just investment, I knew I'd have somebody that well, I'll put it this way. You can think about this. Charlie, in all the years we worked together, not only never once lied to me, ever, but he didn't even shape things so that he told half lies or quarter lies to sort of stack the deck in the direction he wanted to go. He was
wavering AI demand, of course, on this really boosting the market from a point perspective. NVIDIA, that's one of the top performers for the S&P 500. So yeah, lots of strength here on election day. Microsoft, Tesla, Meta, Broadcom, Amazon, all of those big tech names higher. If you were to try to weave some sort of a political story into that, you could perhaps say that's anti-Trump trade, only because if the former president, Donald Trump, does win, the expectation is that he may be somewhat negative toward big tech. That might be a bit of a stretch today, though, given the fact that DJT is higher. You have crypto up more than 3%. Something I want to talk about, though, having nothing to do with the election. We were talking about it a little bit last hour. ADM, Archer Daniels Midland, they pre-announced to the downside. You also have Celanese, the chemical company. That stock down more than 15%. Their fourth quarter profit guidance disappointed following quote-unquote severely constrained demand. Apparently has something to do with Europe, but then also Cleveland-Cliffs, the steel company, that stock down nearly 10%. So you have some of these companies that provide these fundamental items into the economy where there seems to be demand issues. It's just interesting to see it all happening. Now, in this one quarter for all these different types of companies. Now, does that have something to do with the election? Because, of course, Delta, and I think it was United Airlines or one of the other airlines saying that the election could somehow create a ripple for travel. So is there some other sort of ripple around the election? We don't know, but this will certainly be worth watching in the next quarter to see if we're finally going to get the long-awaited soft recession.
Yeah, because we've had the manufacturing side of the economy has been in contraction, whereas we got the services ISM today very strong. So again, if you ask to a lot of, folks in the Rust Belt, we've been in a recession for a couple of years.
That's a great point. And there's also been a trucking recession. So yes, in terms of the fundamental economy, that's a great point, Paul, for sure. And while you could say that from a pure stock perspective, you could say that manufacturing has largely gone outside of the U.S. and doesn't reflect demand, these companies are saying it is a reflection of demand, not necessarily in the U.S., but that they're, that the consumer piece of the market, there's a little bit of a softness there for these particular types of items. Again, steel, chemicals. There was one type of chemical in particular, and then agriculture. Now, the ADM, that has also to do with some accounting issues, apparently. But when you see weakness like this in the fundamental economy, again, something to watch going forward. One quarter, a trend does not make.
Yeah, just looking at the volume, I was mentioning the volume earlier. Actually, the volumes for the Dow and the S&P are kind of in line with their 30-day average, but NASDAQ's running like 40% above. So we're starting to see, I think it's probably those Palantir numbers, people jumping into the tech trade.
Palantir is ridiculous. I mean, that's just an absurd sort of gain.
It's kind of
higher,
like the reverse of the index effect, because it was just recently added into the S&P 500.
That's right.
And we usually see once the stock is added, then it falls. I'm thinking super microcomputer, but this is the opposite for Palantir.
Yep, interesting stuff. All right, Abigail, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Abigail Doolittle, she's the chief markets correspondent for Bloomberg News, joining us here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. We've been talking about some of these key states. One of our guests earlier was saying, hey, you really got to pay attention to North Carolina and Georgia. Well, we do pay attention to Georgia, and so does our next guest, Brett Pulley. He's a Bloomberg's, he's the Atlanta bureau chief down there in Atlanta. Brett, what's the feeling down in the great state of Georgia, in Atlanta, and the areas around Atlanta? What's the feeling down there today on Election Day?
Well, Paul, I think that one of the big feelings here is that it's finally here. Like, maybe we can actually put this behind us. Over 4 million people voted early here in Georgia, which is certainly an indication that they were ready. The Secretary of State says that over 1 million are expected to vote today. And so, it'll be interesting. I heard you say earlier this morning, Paul, you talked about watching football in New Jersey the last week and that you couldn't watch without seeing wall-to-wall ads.
Yep.
Let me tell you, we have had ads here. You cannot watch the Georgia Bulldogs, who, of course, are, pretty top-ranked team, or the resurging Atlanta Falcons for like the last 5, 6, 7 weeks without nonstop ads.
Does that make voters, I guess, just a little tired of the election? Or do we know whether that, the flurry of ads leading up to the election they actually have power to maybe fire up an undecided voter or a voter who isn't thinking that they're going to go to the polls and then makes a last-minute decision to go?
Well, you know, the thing is, look, we know that in 2020, it was a matter of about 11,000 votes, right, according to the alleged phone call that came to the Secretary of State here that the president at that time, the former president, was looking for. So, you know, look, a small number of votes can make a difference if this thing is really close when you start talking about 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 votes. And that does come down to that ability to get voters out, you know, on election day. So it's all about turnout now, as they say.
Brett, what's the political makeup? I don't know if you can generalize about the state of Georgia. Obviously, Atlanta is one of the biggest cities in the United States, yet much of Georgia is rural. How does that translate into kind of voting traditionally?
No, you're right. Atlanta is the largest city here and is surrounded by a lot of rural areas, a couple of other large urban areas. But, you know, what we've seen is a state that really has been purple the last couple of cycles. And, you know, the truth of the matter is it's been very, very close here. But the former president, Trump, has not done that well here in recent elections. You figure he lost 2020, which he was then, of course, indicted for his activity following that. And then in 2022, he ran a candidate against the governor, Brian Kemp, and he lost that election. He ran a candidate against Senator Raphael Warnock, and they lost that. And so it's been close, but he really has not been doing as well in recent election cycles. Nonetheless, 2020 was the first time that a Democratic presidential candidate won here in some time.
Brett, what are the issues that the candidates have been kind of honing in on specifically for Atlanta and Georgia voters more broadly?
Well, I think if you take a close look at issues and certainly advertising, it's women's reproductive rights. It's interestingly, a lot of the ads that I alluded to during the football games and stuff, those are mostly immigration and same-sex marriage, issues like such as those. And over the weekend, the former President Trump had surrogates here, his daughter-in-law and others who were speaking to groups of women. And it's really interesting that he's even focused in to the extent that he has on urban areas such as Atlanta and Fulton County, which have been overwhelmingly Democratic. But I think it indicates that, you know, he sees an opportunity to perhaps peel some voters off there. And then, you know, given the fact that the vice president has been here so much during the campaign and was here on Saturday for a star-studded affair, I think that she's well aware of I think, the opportunity where those voters are concerned. And those are really aimed, you know, not just at black men, but at men overall, I think, in the state of Georgia.
Brett, thanks so much. Really appreciate getting your time here. Brett Pulley, he's the Atlanta bureau chief for Bloomberg News. I knew Brett when he actually worked for a living. He covered the media industry for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal back in the 90s. Now he's a suit managing the bureau, but he does great stuff down there in Atlanta, giving us a good feel for what's happening down there in that really key state, as Brett was suggesting. You got the Atlanta market and then everything else down there. Let's head down to Washington, D.C. Let's talk a little bit of policy here. And we can do that with Nathan Dean. He's a Bloomberg Intelligence senior policy analyst. Nathan, what's the feeling in D.C. as the rest of the country starts going to the polls here? Any smart money leaning one way or the other, or is it, as most folks suggest, really too close to call at this point?
So I think it's too close to call in the presidential race and then the House race. I think essentially I can tell you who I think is going to win, but then I have to give you a 5-minute explanation. And if I do that, I'm not really explaining anything. But what we can say is that we generally think the Republicans are going to take the Senate. Why? This is a very difficult race for the Democrats. They're defending 23 out of the 34 seats out there. Senator Joe Manchin is resigning. The Republicans are going to most likely take West Virginia. They could potentially take Montana as well. You know, Senator John Tester is not doing so well there in the polling wise. But why does that matter? Well, it means that if President Trump wins, a deregulatory effort can happen much quicker. And if Kamala Harris wins, it means the Republicans can effectively block or jam up a lot of her nominees for their own regulatory efforts. But just on the main thing of who's going to win the race, we're going to have to wait until tonight.
What are the implications for investors here and for markets? You know, what kind of results could we be hearing in the next few days that would move the market, or that investors would need to know about?
Yeah, so we were trying to think of like the major catalysts of what happens if you get a Harris victory versus a Trump victory. The first one is tariffs. I mean, we think that the tariffs are going to come no matter who wins the president next year, but is it a broad tariff, 60% on all goods coming from China, or a very small subset? So once you decide, or once we figure out who the president is, we'll know what the tariff outlook looks like for next year. The other thing is investment banks. If Kamala Harris wins, the Basel III Endgame, a rule that increases capital about 9% for the banks, will most likely go forward. If President Trump wins, that's not going to happen. The Inflation Reduction Act, mostly cemented if Kamala Harris wins, could be tweaked. So if you have exposure to renewables and the renewables industry, that's something to keep in mind. And then the last thing is that if the Republicans have a great night and take the House, the Senate, and the presidency, then the opportunity for reconciliation for massive tax reform next year, think multi-trillion-dollar tax reform at the tail end of 2025, that comes to play if the Republicans have a great night.
If former President Trump were to win, what would he do on day one? Would he be just doing tariffs across the board? Because that is something that a president can do.
Yeah, so, you know, President Trump, if you look at the executive orders, now our view is that I'd say about 85% of executive orders are symbolic in nature. It's a fancy way of the president picking up the phone and directing to his or her staff, do something either the legislative route or the regulatory route. But the power of the presidency is more powerful than that other 15%, and that's national security, foreign relations, tariffs, and trade. Now, Congress has largely delegated tariffs to the president, and there's some thought out there that, you know, President Trump would need congressional authorization. Our view is that there's a lot that he could do unilaterally, and so if President Trump comes in day one, expect those executive orders to come out. Now, when it comes to a tariff, I think you would see the red line come across the Bloomberg terminal and say, you know, President Trump signs executive order on tariff. Within the language of that tariff executive order, though, there'd be language essentially saying this won't go into fruition for another 270 days or 365 days. Why? It's a negotiation tool, and presidents don't want to back themselves up into corners. They want the flexibility to see what the reciprocal tariff would look like before it actually goes into fruition. So there's a little bit of headline risk there, but the ultimate impact of a tariff, if President Trump wins, would probably be in the second or third quarter of next year.
And Nathan, what are you going to be watching for policy-wise with the lame duck president if we do find out a winner, let's say, this week or even next week?
Yeah, you know, it's hard to believe we're talking about lame duck, but Congress comes back next week. And so there are a couple of things that the lobbyists around town are all loving to see if they can get this attached. Because remember, we have a government funding fight coming up in December. Now, there's two things that we're really looking on. First is stablecoins. Now, there's this idea that there's a stablecoin bill that could pass during the lame duck. I may be a little bit out of consensus. I don't think it's going to happen. I think they're going to push the can to 2025 because lame ducks are always optimistic from the lobbyist perspective. But when the reality hits and most people just want to go home because the election's over, they usually don't tend to have much outs there. The other thing I would just note is Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois will most likely try to reattach his bill called the Credit Card Competition Act. If you've flown through LaGuardia, New York, you may have seen the ads about this bill taking away credit card points associated with airlines and so forth like this. This would open up competition in terms of networks on credit cards. Again, some headline risk there. I don't think it's going to happen, though. I think, again, they'll get kicked to 2025, but certainly something we have to pay attention to.
All right, Nathan, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Nathan Dean, he's a senior policy analyst for Bloomberg Intelligence. He's down there in Washington, D.C. He and his team, they really focus on policies coming out of Congress and which industries, and maybe even down to the company levels, which will be impacted. And that's the research that he and his team do, and it's widely valued by Bloomberg customers because we know many industries are heavily regulated and dependent upon government policy. So it's good to have Nathan Dean and his team down there in D.C. What are you looking at here, Emily? We got some stocks still holding on to their gains.
I'm really shocked to see Bitcoin up as well. Maybe not too shocked, but it is one of, I guess, the biggest moves on my market screen. It's up 4% right now, just under 70,000. Some would argue that is the Trump trade manifesting. Traders think Bitcoin, it's going to be better under Trump. Let's buy that before the election. We also have Ether. I know, Paul, you don't like these cryptos.
No, I'm actually into it. I'm not as bad as Tom, but they are certainly volatile. But there's interesting to see how, again, Bitcoin just under $70,000 per token. The stock market is higher. The S&P 500 up 50 points right now. It's about 0.9%. We're gonna have more coming up. This is Bloomberg.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash. Stocks higher and technology shares leading the way today. Software company Palantir Technologies, right now those shares are up 22.3%. They delivered a bigger profit revenue than analysts expected for the latest quarter. A lot of that had to do with artificial intelligence. Treasury yields, they are rallying. Yields are higher after a report that showed growth in the services industry in the U.S. accelerated last month. Again, services, the biggest part of the U.S. economy. The 2-year, 6 basis points higher, 422. The 10-year, that's up 7 basis points. That is at 435. And right now, the S&P 500, 52 points higher. That's up 0.9%. 57.65 on the index. The Dow Jones Industrial Average 310 points higher, and the Nasdaq 100 is up 222 points. That is a rise of 1.1%. Now, according to Sam Stovall, you know him, he's the chief investment strategist at CFRA, the S&P 500 has risen in 73% of the years where a Democrat was president, and 70% of the years when a Republican was the chief executive. He measured from 1945 through late last month. The general hope among investors is often for split control of the U.S. government. You've heard this before. That's because it's more likely to keep the status quo and avoid any big changes. I guess, do no harm is the theme there. Anyway, we check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker, and that is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Emily and Paul.
All right, John Tucker, thank you so much. We appreciate that. It is Emily Graffeo sitting in for Alex Steele. I'm Paul Sweeney. We're live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, and we're streaming live on YouTube as well. So check us out there at Bloomberg Podcast is where you can go search for us. Every cycle, every election cycle, it seems to one of the key issues is always it's the economy. Focus on the economy. Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago, and so on and so forth. Our next guest thinks about that stuff as well. Christopher Smart, managing partner at Arbroath Group and former special assistant to the president for international economics, joining us from Boston, Massachusetts via that Zoom thing. Christopher, how, again, too close to call, we get all of that. How are you kind of framing out this election and kind of the risks and opportunities just from an economic policy perspective?
Well, I think as you were mentioning earlier, the market really does focus also, by the way, on the economics. And weirdly, as all of our political tools to predict the outcome of this election seem to be failing us today, the economic data seems like it's actually painting a pretty consistent picture. Good growth, low unemployment, inflation coming down, rates we'll find out Thursday, but money likely to become cheaper. And that, I think, more than anything explains what's going on in the market overall. I think what's also a little bit strange is that, in one way, we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow or tonight. But in another way, neither outcome is going to be a huge surprise for the market the way it was, for example, in 2016 when President Trump first won against Hillary Clinton. And so I guess, with some certainty about who the next president is going to be, we hope we find that out tonight or tomorrow. That should lead the market to rally a little bit, but I'm not sure we could expect a big move one way or the other, except in some of these key so-called Trump trades, either rising or falling depending on the outcome.
Christopher, to what extent do you think prediction markets and I guess the rise of betting on the outcome of the election have somehow changed this election versus what we have seen in prior races? What role have those prediction markets played here?
I think it's a great question, and I'm not sure I have a good answer yet. I mean, I think we need to sort of see these markets develop over a couple of cycles. I'm not sure I believe, that they are great predictors of the outcome. I mean, you've seen actually them moving with the polls to some extent as President Trump's momentum seems to have flagged of late. You've seen some of those things tighten. You've seen the Bitcoin trade come off, except for today. You've seen the peso bounce a little bit as Vice President Harris's odds appear to be improving in the polls. So I think we'll be looking at those markets more closely in terms of how deep they are, who's participating, who's got the really big bets on, are they big enough to actually move those numbers? But I think they're kind of interesting, but maybe not, going to move a lot of money one way or the other.
Chris, I hear a lot about the Trump trade. Is that anything more than, long the dollar, short bonds? Is that a reasonable way to think about it, or is it a little more nuanced than that?
I think that's very, well, it's more nuanced when you dig down into, clean energy stocks versus oil stocks, when you look at, for example, retailers that are very sensitive to tariffs. They are the anti-Trump trade versus banks that are probably less sensitive to tariffs and maybe hoping for some deregulation. So within certain sectors, I think you get a differentiation. But I think overall, there is a sense that a Trump presidency will, ironically for Republicans over the past number of years, be the less fiscal hawkish administration. And so that is a trade where, if he wins, the expectation is more inflation, bigger budget deficit, maybe higher tariffs higher prices with tariffs, and a crackdown on immigration. That, I think, is what captures it all in terms of what you're seeing in bond yields as well as maybe stock prices.
How much do you anticipate the FOMC meeting and the Fed decision on Thursday to drive markets when it comes during, such a pivotal week for the future of the U.S. presidency?
Well, I think a lot of us have forgotten that there was an FOMC meeting this week. With all apologies to Jerome Powell, he may appreciate the fact that the spotlight won't be so glaring on him on Thursday. I think the Fed has done an extraordinary job through an election cycle, through a very partisan period in our history, to really focus on its own knitting, really focus on the data, really focus on when it feels that it can bring interest rates down. And other than a few partisan voices on one side or the other, I think the markets don't believe that this is a partisan move on their part, and I think that's why they have, really tried to make sure they are delivering that message, and I think that's what most people believe.
All right, Christopher, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Christopher Smart, he is a managing partner at Arbroath Group and a former special assistant to the president for international economics, joining us from Boston. Let's head down to Miami. Let's head down to Palm Beach, more specifically, Trump headquarters, Mar-a-Lago. Felipe Marquez, Bloomberg Miami bureau chief. Felipe, what's the feeling within the Trump orbit down there in South Florida today?
Well, thank you for asking me. I was here since yesterday, and Palm Beach is buzzing. All the flights are full. I talked to a couple Trump supporters. They all expect a blowout today. They basically expect that the young male voter that Trump has been catering to in the next couple of weeks is going to show up at Election Day and is going to easily carry them for a win. So the mood is pretty positive.
And what do we know about Trump's plans for tonight as he's watching this race come in?
So let me start with the plans for now, which we have a little bit more certainty because with everything Trump related, there's always a high degree of uncertainty. So he's probably casting his vote at about now-ish, like probably pretty soon. And then Melania are going to vote here in Palm Beach. Then they're going to go to Mar-a-Lago, where they're probably going to start waiting for the election results to come in. We're expecting at some point during the night to go to the West Palm Beach Convention Center, where we're going to have a big party waiting for him, where I will be later tonight. There's going to be a VIP area there, so we expect a lot of big figures in the government, but there's also going to be a VIP watch party at Mar-a-Lago for those that are members of the club or closer to his inner circle. So I'm sure there's probably going to be a lot of very important people there as well.
So down in South Florida, how is the political environment in South Florida, just generally speaking, because it's such a growing and diverse part of the country?
It's interesting that you ask. So if you're having this conversation, let's say a decade ago, maybe like a little bit more, Florida would be considered a swing state, right? We would be right up at the swing state coverage as Georgia, or now it's solidly in red. And you're gonna test that this week with the election results, right? Especially Palm Beach. If you look at Palm Beach, it's become a big center of the GOP universe. You have Trump living here, obviously, but you also have a large number of his supporters. You have a big number of his donors, all in the orbit of the president, all in the orbit of Mar-a-Lago.
And does Palm Beach draw a crowd? Are you noticing, streets packed here today, that people who aren't necessarily residents are coming down to Palm Beach, I guess, to support former President Trump?
I can tell you about last night. When I went out for dinner, the restaurant was packed, and it didn't look like there were a lot of people that are from Palm Beach themselves. You could see it by the shirts, you could see it by the way they were dressing. All of it had that Republican regalia that immediately connects you to Donald Trump. Obviously, there's blockages in around the convention center, right? I'm right across the street. The streets are blocked. There's a lot of traffic. I'm pretty sure Palm Beach residents, which are very finicky about the amount of traffic they usually face, are not very happy about it. But there is certainly a crowd.
Felipe, talk to us about the Cuban vote in South Florida. How does that break these days, and has that changed?
Okay, so with the Cuban voter in South Florida, he's usually Republican. They're not a monolith, obviously. So let's not reduce Cuban voters to that. But there is a strong contingent of them that vote Republican. So do the Venezuelans, by the way. There's even a term for it. We call it the Venezuelans. They break Republican. They endorse some of Trump's policies on immigration. Obviously, the Puerto Rico comments hurt them a little bit of that group as well, right? Talking about the comedian comments that called Puerto Rico a floating island of garbage at the Madison Square Garden last week, right? Obviously, they hurt them with that contingent, but they have been strongly Republican, and they have made up, and they are part of what made Florida so Republican the last couple of years.
Interesting. All right, Felipe, thank you so much for that on-the-ground reporting. Felipe Marquez, Miami Bureau Chief for Bloomberg News, reporting there from Mar-a-Lago in Palm Beach, Florida. Again, that is the center, as Felipe said, one of the centers of the Republican Party these days. And it's interesting to see how that's evolved over the last several election cycles.
He said there'll be some big names within the GOP, but I think maybe also within finance going out to Mar-a-Lago tonight.
Probably. We'll see how that plays out. We'll have all that reporting here. Stocks still trading higher here, folks. Around up 1% on the S&P 500, but about 1.3% on the NASDAQ. So a strong day for U.S. stocks. Yields pushing a little bit higher here. 10-year Treasuries up 7 basis points. 4.35%. The Bloomberg Dollar Index showing some weakness here, off just a little bit versus some of the major currencies around the world. In commodity space, WTI crude oil, it's up 1.5% now at $72.50. Gold higher, and Bitcoin up just about 5%, 70,400. Matt Miller, happy about that. If you could just find his code for his token. This is Bloomberg. Good morning.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash. Let's start with the most active stock. That belongs to Palantir Technologies. Also, it just happens to be the best performer in the S&P 500 right now. The share is soaring to a record after the company reported better than expected quarterly revenue. They also raised the forecast. They're citing what they call unwavering AI demand. Shares of Palantir right now up close to 23%. And that enthusiasm also spilling over into shares of NVIDIA. NVIDIA is the biggest gainer in terms of index points, and it's inching closer to reclaiming title of the world's most valuable company from Apple. You also had some economic data today. That was the strong ISM services data. Services, of course, I keep telling you, the biggest part of the U.S. economy. That is supporting stocks, implying that the economy continues to perform well. Meantime, Kelsey Barrow at J.P. Morgan Investment Management says, you know what, the election presents opportunities for investors.
I think the key is, with all this uncertainty, is really not to get distracted and use this as an excuse to stay in cash. So our motto has been follow the alphabet, the ABCs, anything but cash.
Right now, the S&P 500, 55 points higher. That's up 1%, 57.67 on the index. The Dow Jones Industrial Average up 314 points. That's up 0.75%. The NASDAQ 100, 233 points higher. That is a rise of 1.2%. Oh, here's a stat for you. Put this in your pipe and smoke it. Federal election officials say the elections will cost $15.9 billion this year. That's billion with a B, according to the Project Open Secrets. More than $15.1 billion, just for comparison's sake, was spent in 2020. So
you know where a lot of that goes? Local television.
Oh, they're like, they're just rolling in it.
Exactly.
Could you imagine, like, the Pittsburgh stations, the Philly stations, just like, and none of the other ad, like, Joe the plumber can't get his ad
That's
on
right.
because he can't compete.
That's right. Yep. And so it's a boon for local TV stations. Now it's gotten so much that it's really just for the swing states. Hey, where do you have TV stations? And you pick stocks like that.
Yeah, exactly.
So, anyway. All right, John Tucker, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Emily Grafeo sitting in for Alex Steele. I'm Paul Sweeney. We are live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio, streaming live on YouTube as well. All right, the polls, they're telling us too close to call, which raises a reasonable question. Do you believe in the polls? I think our next guest does. Cliff Young, he's the president of Ipsos Polling, joins us from Washington, D.C. Cliff, thanks so much for taking the time here. I know it's a busy time for you. What are your polls telling you?
I must believe in the polls, right? I'm a pollster. So our polls are saying it's neck and neck, right? It's slightly Harris at the national level, but that doesn't matter. What matters really are the swing states. And it's really 50-50 there. I mean, obviously, we think we're right as an industry that the polls are on. Obviously, we've had problems in the past. In 2016 and 2020, we did a lot of work to try to adjust our samples and adjust our methodologies. But ultimately, if we're off by a point one way or a point another way, we are talking a blowout, a blue blowout or a red blowout. So this thing is extremely close. And ultimately, it will come down to those key swing states.
Cliff, how has the rise of prediction markets and I guess the use of those influenced your line of business in this election?
Well, over time, sort of the polling industry has worked.
Hey, Cliff, we're going to have to just end it there. President Trump is speaking, so we may come back to you. President Trump just voted. He's speaking now in South Florida.
The lines are long, and the conservative lines, the Republican lines, are very long. We got back pretty late last night, and it was an honor. It was a great honor. We had 4 incredible rallies and left Michigan late at night. Many of you were with us, and I hear we're doing very well. We did a great job in that we brought it back to the states, as you know. I believe in exceptions, as Ronald Reagan did. And we did a great job. We did something that they've wanted to do for 52 years. Yes, please.
Mr. President, you talked a lot about if you win, there are going to be tens of millions of Harris supporters who are going to be upset. What would your plan be to reach out to those people, bring them in? What would your message be?
Well, it'll be just that. We want to bring everybody in. We want to be very inclusive, and we will be very inclusive. We have a great country, but we have a country that's in trouble. It's in big trouble in many ways, and we have to straighten it out. We have crime is through the roof. We have people pouring through our borders that are not exactly perfect. They come out of prisons. 13,000 people convicted of murder. We don't need this in our country. We have enough difficulty. We don't need that. So I think people saw that, and it just seems that the conservatives are voting very powerfully. Just finish it up. Go ahead.
How are you feeling? Nervous?
No, I feel very confident. I have felt. You know, we went in with a very big lead today, and it looks like Republicans have shown up in force. So we'll see how it turns out. But it seems that they have really shown up in force. I just got a call from Dan Patrick in Texas. He said they've never seen anything like it. It's been very good.
Looking back, is there anything you would do differently about your campaign? Anything you regret about how you ran this campaign?
Look, regrets. You always have regrets. I can't think of any, to be honest, to use her expression. I can't think of any. Look, I ran a great campaign. I think it was maybe the best of the three. We did great in the first one. We did much better in the second one, but something happened. And this was the best. I would say this was the best campaign we ran.
President Trump, do you accept the possibility that you and Vice President Harris both might not get to 270 electoral votes by the end of tonight?
It should never happen. A thing like that should never happen. This election should be over. They spend all this money on machines. And frankly, if they'd use paper ballots, it would be over by 10 o'clock. And by the way, the paper ballots would cost 8%. It would be 8% of the cost. If they would use paper ballots, voter ID, proof of citizenship, and one-day voting, it would all be over by 10 o'clock in the evening. It's crazy. They use these very expensive computers, and I'm hearing in Pennsylvania they won't have an answer till 2 or 3 days from now. I think it's an absolute outrage if that's the case. Now, maybe it'll be later, but it's paper ballots in France. They went paper ballots because the mail-in was not working. It was corrupt. And in France, they went paper ballots. And at 10 o'clock in the evening, they had 37 million votes counted and done. They had a winner, they had a loser. And in this country, I mean, I'm just hearing that in certain states, it's going to be a long time, and it won't even be close. It won't even be that close. They say, I'm going to win the state, but it's going to take a long time to certify it.
Could you see a world where you don't declare victory tonight?
Yeah, I mean, I'm hearing the same things that you're hearing. I'm hearing states where I'm up by a lot, but they won't have a final number for a long time.
What are your plans for tonight in terms of watching the results and so forth?
So we're going to have a very special group of people, many of whom you know, and they'll be at Mar-a-Lago. In addition, we'll have 4,000 or 5,000 people at the convention center. On the assumption I win, I mean, I don't know if something else happens. I don't know what's going to happen in terms of declaring victory, but if in normal times I would go over to the convention center, let's say at 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock or something, but I just don't know. It looks like we have a very substantial lead. It looks like we have many more Republicans voting today than Democrats. So if you have a lead and we have a bigger vote, that means you're doing very well, but they have to call a winner. They should. And they should call a winner, yes. Just stop talking about that. Go ahead. Oh, I don't know. I was honored to get Joe Rogan last night. I mean, Joe Rogan's a big deal. He's a very respected person. And I must tell you, Megan was fantastic. She got up and said some things that were really pretty amazing. But before that, I just think we ran a good campaign. I had good policy. We want people to come into our country, but they have to come in legally. You know, we want strong borders, and We want people to come in. We want to be totally inclusive, but they have to come in. I think that was a big issue. To me, that was the biggest issue. I may be wrong. You know, a lot of people said inflation. Inflation's a disaster, but I think it's a second issue. I think the first is the border. We can't allow criminals to be put back into our country or to be put into our country. So you have 13,000 plus murderers allowed to roam in our country. Not going to be allowed. They have to go. You have drug dealers. You have terrorists. You have a tremendous amount of people that should not be in our country, and we need strong borders in this country. And I think people are voting in. I think it's personally, I think it's the number one issue. We'll see how it pans out, but I think it's the number one issue. I don't have to tell them that. I don't have to tell them that there'll be no violence. Of course there'll be no violence. My supporters are not violent people. I don't have to tell them that. And I certainly don't want any violence, but I certainly don't have to tell. These are great people. These are people that believe in no violence. Unlike your question, you believe in violence. Go ahead. Well, I think I'll be at Mar-a-Lago for the most part. We have a lot of political professionals. I'm going over now with Melania, who I'm very proud of. She's got the #1 bestseller. Can you believe that? He can believe it. But so we're very proud of the job she's done with that. Her book is #1. But we're going to go over to the office in West Palm, and we're going to say hello to the workers. They've worked very hard.
Will Georgia kind of be your first indication of whether it's going to be?
I think so. I mean, I hear we're doing very well there in Georgia. I hear we're doing very well. I hear we're doing very well everywhere. Now, I may regret that statement, but I'm hearing that we're doing very well. Would you go louder? No, I haven't prepared a speech. No, I did speeches last night, all day long, all night long. At 2 o'clock in the morning, we left, and we did a lot of speeches. You can probably tell. No, I don't have to do that. You know, I'm not a Democrat. I'm able to make a speech on pretty quick notice. If I win, I know what I'm going to say, and I don't even want to think about the losing part. I would like to tell all of the people that are online to stay online. We have tremendous Republican lines, and I've been asked actually to say it. It takes a while. I'd like to just make the statement that I'd like the Republicans to stay online. Democrats, if they'd like, they can leave. But I'd like the Republicans to stay online. I have no pressure whatsoever. I'm winning big cases. Those cases are all being won. The biggest case was the Florida case, and it's been won. I appreciate your nice question.
Sir, you and Mrs. Trump have been doing
No
this
pressure whatsoever.
for 9 years. Regardless of what happens tonight, is this your last campaign? Are you done after this?
Yeah, I would think so. I would think so.
How do you feel about it?
Sad, and very fulfilled. I think we're going to have a very big victory today.
Mr. How are you feeling?
Very good, thank you. Thank you.
We have already a transition team, but I don't like talking about that until I find out how we do. I mean,
So how does this sort of threat from Iran and sort of assassination attempts sort of shape your thinking on stuff, right?
well, it doesn't. Look, we're not looking to do damage to Iran, but they can't have a nuclear weapon. And so, you know, my terms are very easy. They can't have a nuclear weapon. I'd like them to be a very successful country, but they just can't have a nuclear weapon.
Does it change the way you live? All the threats
Well, I think Secret Service has been a little bit tougher, to put it mildly. I see more machine guns than I've ever seen in my life. We're surrounded by, I feel very confident with Secret Service. I think they've stepped up. Look, for a long time, they didn't give us the help. They didn't give us the assets, as they say, the manpower, woman power. They didn't give it to us. And we'd have rallies. You saw the rallies, 50, 60,000 people. And I'd have less people than Joe Biden, who had 5 people show up, and I'd have 55,000 people show up, and I had fewer people than him. So they should have done a much better job. And frankly, the president should make a very strong statement to the outside world, because
How are you feeling about your team as you head into the last day?
I think my team is incredible. Look, they say it's the best run campaign they've seen. Some people said it's the best run campaign they've ever seen. But in order to make that stick, you have to win.
How do you feel compared to how confident now that you were about your team than you were in the last 2 races?
My team, I'm very confident in. Many of them are the same players. As you know, Susie, a lot of the people are the same players. They've been very good.
Mr. President, Oprah said at Harris's rally last night, quote, "If we don't show up tomorrow, it is entirely possible we won't be able to count the ballot."
Well, I think it's ridiculous. You know, Oprah, I was on her last show, or one of her last shows, and they picked the biggest people and all of that, and made a big deal. And I'm disappointed. I think Oprah's become a major divider in our country, and I think, frankly, she should be ashamed of herself. And you know who else should be ashamed? Fox, because I've seen Oprah on Fox about 50 times making the same statement, and I think it's a disgrace what Fox does, because everyone thinks Fox is so pro-Trump. They're not pro-Trump at all. They've put Oprah on all morning long. That's all I see is Oprah. And, you know, I do Oprah very well. She's been at Mar-a-Lago many times. Roger King had his funeral. That's the head of King World, which was Oprah's mentor. And Oprah chose the location. She said, Mar-a-Lago is the most beautiful place. Would it be possible to have Roger's funeral at Mar-a-Lago in the ballroom? We did it. The only time I've ever had a funeral there. And I think Oprah should be ashamed of herself to say that. She should be ashamed. She knows me. She wanted to run with me as a vice president. She was going to be the vice president. She wrote me a letter. It's in the book. And now she goes and makes statements like that. She's a divider. And Barack Hussein Obama is a divider, too.
There are people who are concerned that you didn't concede the election in 2020 when you lost. They're concerned that if you lost this election, you wouldn't concede again. What do you say to those people?
I think they're crazy. If I lose an election, if it's a fair election, I'd be the first one to acknowledge it. And I think so far, I think it's been fair. I think there's been a lot of court cases. Both sides are lawyered up. Thousands of lawyers are involved, thousands, can you imagine? And part of that is because we have too complicated a process. If we had a piece of paper, watermarked, you know that paper is more sophisticated now than computers. It's watermarked paper. It's unbelievable what happens with it. There's nothing you can do to cheat. And of course, you have practically nothing to run. Think of it. We spend hundreds of millions and billions of dollars on these campaigns. You could do it for 8% of the cost and have accuracy, and we wouldn't have to be worried about when is Pennsylvania going to announce. It's really a shame.
Last question.
Well, he knows exactly what, but that's only based on what RFK told. I don't think RFK wanted that. You're talking about Health and Human Services. Let me tell you, he's a great guy, RFK, and he's going to do pretty much what he wants as far as I'm concerned. He wants health for women, for men, for children, and I happen to agree with a lot of the things he says. The one thing I told him, and I've told you in speeches for the last 2 weeks, we got to keep them away from the liquid gold, because the liquid gold, we have more than any of it. It's called oil and gas. That one I'm going to handle.
But in your cabinet,
Well, I'd be honored to have him. Now, I haven't spoken to Howard about that, but look, if you think of it, he came in third, in running for president, right? He ran a very good race. He had obstacles. The Democrats just really unfairly put obstacles up. And Henson Kennedy left the Democrat Party for the Republicans. Now, he's a very smart guy. He's a very caring guy. He's very popular, too. We get up and introduce him. The place goes wild. No, we love having him. And you know who else we love having? Elon. He's been great. And everybody, look, everybody. Getting Joe Rogan last night and Megyn Kelly. This is very inclusive. This is a movement. This is the greatest political movement in the history of our country. And even you people, and some of you are fair sometimes, but it's the greatest movement in the history of our country. And I've made that statement 1,000 times. It has never been challenged. It is the greatest movement, and we're going to make America great again. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you. Nice to see you.
Donald Trump speaking live in Florida, having cast his ballot at a recreation center in Palm Beach, Florida, and a rare sighting of the former First Lady, Melania Trump, at his side. Donald Trump saying that, so far, I hear we're doing very well. He went on to tell reporters, I've been very honored to find out lines are long. The conservative lines, he said, the Republican line, seems conservatives are voting very powerfully, adding, so far, I think it's been fair. This is how we begin our coverage today. At high noon on the East Coast, I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines on a special edition of Balance of Power. Welcome to Election Day. Kaylee, we made it. After many twists and turns in this campaign, there's no more campaigning, only time to vote.
Indeed, as we have just seen Donald Trump do. Kamala Harris, of course, has also ended her campaign. She will be in D.C. while Donald Trump is in Florida this evening as we all wait for the tally to come in. At this point, it is no longer about trying to convince American voters who to vote for. It's just showing up to vote at all if they decide to do so today, keeping in mind that to calculate, to tabulate all of these votes, to get that final tally could take some time, knowing that more than 80 million Americans voted early before this election day.
That's absolutely right. It's staggering number here coming off of what we saw during the pandemic. These are numbers that many people never saw coming. Polls could not be tighter. This is an election that we have been set up here with a true tie. It's essentially 50-50 at the top of the ticket, and that goes for a lot of races down ballot as well. Even the voters of Dixville Notch couldn't figure it out, Kaylee. 6 of them, they tied 3-3 after going all in for Joe Biden in 2020.
Yeah, and keeping in mind that at one point in this race, it was Joe Biden that was going to be the Democratic nominee for president, but clearly a lot has changed. This 2024 election cycle has been unlike any other. And here's a reminder of what we've all been through.
Whether democracy is still America's sacred cause is the most urgent question of our time. That's what the 2024 election is all about.
They call it Super Tuesday for a reason. This is a big one. And we have no choice because November 5th is right around the corner.
Look, if we finally beat Medicare.
Thank you, President Biden. President Trump?
Well, he's right. He did beat Medicare. He beat it to death. If I had not moved my head at that very last instant, the assassin's bullet would have perfectly hit its mark, and I would not be here tonight.
You know, there is a time and a place for long years of experience in public life. There's also a time and a place for new voices.
You can always trust me to put country above party and self.
We have inflation like very few people have ever seen before.
Donald Trump left us the worst unemployment since the Great Depression.
America will be bigger, better, bolder, richer, safer, and stronger than ever before.
We are optimistic and excited about what we can do together.
To think we've gone through all of this together, bringing us now to this moment on Election Day. We start our coverage on the ground with Bloomberg's David Gura, who is in Philadelphia right now. Of course, the big prize tonight, Pennsylvania. And David, we may not know by tomorrow who won it.
That's right, Joe. And so, you know, the weather here is beautiful. I want to say that first of all, and I think that's a positive sign for those who are going to cast their ballots today. This is a state that really put a lot of emphasis on voting early, and the way that's done here is through mail-in ballots. People requested them, they were sent them, they could return them through the Postal Service or go to county offices to bring them back in. Those who didn't do that or didn't do that on time are going to the polls today, and the lines are long across this state. I've been checking in with officials across the state from both parties, Democrats and Republicans, and they say turnout is good. But everyone is acknowledging the fact that this is, as you put it, a razor-thin race at the top of the ticket and all the way down. And we've seen that narrowing in these recent weeks. Looking at those most recent polls, the New York Times Siena College poll, putting this as a dead heat. Looking at the Senate race in this state, we've seen that narrowing as well over these last few weeks. So everyone aware of the stakes here, the importance of Pennsylvania, those 19 electoral college votes, and looking at history, acknowledging the fact that most routes to the presidency do come through this state. And as I was in front of the Philadelphia Art Museum behind me last night, that was a refrain we heard over and over again from speakers who were there on behalf of Vice President Harris, acknowledging the fact that this state is important to that campaign. Of course, you'd hear the same thing from the former President Donald Trump's campaign as well. They both know that this state is crucial.
Well, certainly with its 19 electoral votes. But David, you mentioned the down ballot races there we are watching as well, including the incumbent Senator Bob Casey facing a challenger in Dave McCormick, former Bridgewater executive. Is there a sense that someone can win that Senate race if their party does not also win the state at the presidential level?
Republicans certainly hope so, and I mentioned that recent polling. For a while, Senator Casey, the incumbent Democrat, had a 9 percentage point lead in that race. It has narrowed to 5 in that New York Times Siena College poll. And we have seen the way that that race has been framed here come into finer focus in recent days. So there have been kind of small missteps made by Dave McCormick in pronouncing Yingling incorrectly was not a good move here at the beginning of the race. But he made some remarks about the Affordable Care Act more recently in a video that was recorded surreptitiously, saying he wasn't in favor of people up to the age of 26 being able to stay on their parents' health care plan. That is something that we've heard Senator Casey bring up time and time again, most recently as last night in that rally here in Philadelphia. It is something that got a lot of applause, him saying that he wanted to keep that provision in place. You know, here in this race, I was in Wisconsin last week. This is an issue that came up there as well. This notion among Republicans that they might revisit the Affordable Care Act, make changes to health care policy in this country is something that Democrats are sort of raising the specter of to say to voters, look, this policy is in place. Republicans who are trying to challenge it could make rather draconian or extreme changes to that piece of legislation. I should say Bob Casey comes from Pennsylvania political royalty. His dad was the governor of this state 2 times. He's a known quantity, not from Philadelphia, but from Scranton. And so he is trying his hardest here to secure that 4th term.
All right, Bloomberg's David Gura live in Pennsylvania on this election day. Thank you so much. And now we want to turn to another part of the Rust Belt, another battleground state we are watching this evening, and that's Michigan, where we find Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick in Detroit. So, Romaine, we remember during the primary season, 100,000 voters in protest choosing not to vote for what was then candidate Joe Biden in Michigan. It's a question of what those 100,000 and the rest of the voters in this state will do today.
Absolutely, and both candidates spent the last final days of their campaign in the state of Michigan really trying to make their case. Of course, Trump closing it out in the early morning hours today in Grand Rapids, Michigan, not even taking the stage until after midnight, while his speech generally hit on some of the main themes that he's been known for through this campaign. He made it clear that voter turnout was going to be a big factor here in the state of Michigan. And there's a big reason why he joined here. While he did joke a little bit here about superstition, he closed out his 2016 and 2020 campaigns in Grand Rapids as well. But Kent County, where Grand Rapids sit, is a potentially big swing county. In fact, when you talk about the swing state of Michigan, most people talk about 2 swing counties. Oakland, the more prosperous county that encompasses the Detroit suburbs, right where I'm standing, and Kent County, a more middle-class area out far west, closer to Lake Michigan. These have become big barometers here for how the state of Michigan goes. Remember, Kent County actually went for Trump back in 2016, though it went for Biden in 2020. It also went for Obama back in 2008 before turning to Romney in 2012. Make of that what you will here, but both candidates, both campaigns feel that they have to win Kent County as well as Oakland County if they want to win Michigan.
Great setup, Romaine. Joining us from the Northwest Activities Center polling location, awfully busy in Detroit today. Romaine Bostick, thank you so much for being in the field for us on this election day as we assemble our political panel. Can't have an election day without Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, Republican strategist, and Jeannie Shanzano, Democratic analyst, political science professor at Iona University. Great to see you both here. We finally made it. I just want to know what's going through both of your minds here. We're walking into a race that is absolutely deadlocked. Nobody knows what's about to happen. So how do you watch it, Rick?
I love election days. As a former campaign manager, it was the day that I had to myself. You couldn't buy any more TV, no more rallies, no more mail programs to approve. It's fantastic. You just got to make sure that your ground game's out there, turn out, vote. And I think that's critical. I think we're now in the closest race in modern history. It's the fewest number of targeted states, swing states, and it's got the closest polling in any one of those swing states we've ever seen. So Ground game matters. When you interview pollsters, what do you think? What do you think? Ground game. That's when they like punt. Forget all the data. It's ground game. And I think that's correct. And so we know that Kamala Harris has invested heavily. She's got thousands of employees all over the country in these targeted states turning out vote. And Donald Trump is relying on Elon Musk. So is Musk the hero of the Republican Party, coming in, swooping in with his dollars and technology and saving the ground game, or not? And so I think that's what's got everybody on edge. So we'll start seeing the results of that earlier tonight.
Well, so as we consider the ground game, Jeannie, that can't really be captured properly in polls necessarily, right? For all of the talk about how tight the margin is in pretty much every poll you look at, whether it's at the national level or in the battleground states, they can't capture enthusiasm and the likelihood of turnout, really.
Yeah, it's really difficult. And what we hear is that 2%, if these polls are off by 2%, that could be the difference between changing this thing that it's done fast and somebody runs away with it, or it's as tight as we've all been seeing. And, I too have been watching how close this is, and it is historically close. But I think the other thing we should remember is what's at stake here, because this is what the campaigns are telling us. On the Republican side, we hear from Donald Trump, the country is over if Kamala Harris wins. And from the Democrats, we hear democracy is over if Donald Trump wins. I mean, those are some high stakes we're hearing from these campaigns. And think about it. Donald Trump, if he loses, is facing jail. If he wins, he'll have probably more power than any modern president in American history. And Kamala Harris, if she wins, breaks all kinds of glass ceilings. Woman, black, Indian. I mean, the stakes could not be higher tonight. And so I too love election night. I'm very excited, but I'm also a little bit of anxiety. I think so many voters have, not knowing in the last 2 years we've been hearing so much of what our lives are about is at stake here.
We have no shortage of anxiety at the desk here. I wonder, Rick, your thought on the closings. Kamala Harris on the rocky steps said the momentum is on our side and never publicly for a second day mentioned the name of her opponent. Donald Trump went through a couple of swing states, ended up in Grand Rapids, as Romaine mentioned, referring to her low IQ. The contrast couldn't be greater.
Yeah, one is finishing a campaign that has been framed on negativity. Donald Trump, it's how he campaigns. It's who he is, right? It's all about grievance and retribution, and he hasn't changed that at all. And he has the backing of the economy in his back. He could have focused on how he was going to change that, as he did in his first term in 2016, but he didn't. He went ahead and said, I'm going to be the guy that, ruffles feathers. And I must admit, I think Kamala Harris took a shot at that kind of strategy, right? Coming out of her convention, she went negative on Donald Trump, and I think since then she's pulled up the rudders. She's now sailing into a very positive close, and I think she does think she has momentum, and being negative is not a good conducive act for being someone with momentum. So what she's trying to do is create excitement, create positivity around her close, obviously surrounded by celebrities and stars and big rallies and entertainment. That is the campaign of someone who thinks they're going to win. Donald Trump is running a campaign that thinks somebody's going to lose. Wow.
And yet the polls would suggest that neither of those things are abundantly clear at this point. But some of these very same polls, Rick, as we were just discussing with David Gura in Pennsylvania, for example, show that there's wider margins in the down ballot races and the Senate races. In some of these very same battleground states we are talking about, the Democrats are polling far ahead of Kamala Harris. So what does that indicate to you about how things are likely to go?
It's not unusual. I mean, there's usually separation between the presidential candidate and the down ballot. For instance, in 2008, when I ran John McCain's campaign, he ran 9% higher in his ballot than the congressional ballot. In other words, all the people who voted for Republicans in Congress got 9% less votes. So you had almost a 10% vote swing between, the top of the ticket and that down ballot. So it's always sort of, moving around. In the case of the Democrats, it's reverse, where the down ballot's doing better in the state. Now, the question that we all are going to find out tonight is, was there a merging of that ballot? Did Kamala Harris get the benefit of a strong Democratic base in especially these blue wall states that elected 3 popular governors 2 years ago that were significantly higher in the percentages that they got than she's showing right now. If she gets their vote, she wins those 3 states.
I want to get the take of the pollster at the table here with the final calls. John Ralston, Nevada Independent. Harris winning the state by 0.3 of a point. Jackie Rosen, getting back to Rick's point, winning by 5. Big gap there. Larry Sabato, who we know from the program quite a bit. Larry's crystal ball predicting Harris winning the blue wall, plus Nevada, Republicans flipping the Senate, Dems flipping the House, and 538 gives Harris a 50% chance of victory. Trump 49. What do you think of these numbers?
Yeah, I mean, I'd never argue with John Ralston out there because he knows what's going on out there. And so those are, you know, very good signs for Rosen. It's been touch and go out there. Larry Sabato as well. I have a lot of Democratic friends who are very anxious right now.
Yeah.
So the scenarios that they're describing are very, very positive. But, you know, it's just really not fair to call these if we're going to believe what the polls say. And I think one of the reckonings we have tomorrow is with the polls. Either they are right on target and this thing goes down to the wire, or they have miscalculated to the degree they did in 2016 and 2020, underestimating Donald Trump's get out the vote. So it's really hard responsibly to say at this point who's ahead and who's behind.
Yeah.
Well, as we consider the group of voters that has voted already is incredibly large. More than 83 million people voted before Election Day of an eligible electorate of just 244 million. Even Donald Trump was referencing this when we just heard him speak in Florida, Jeannie, and the idea that Republicans showed up early to a degree which we did not see in 2020. What does that signal about what we're likely to see as the results begin getting reported tonight?
Yeah, we're probably not going to see as dramatic a mirage effect as we did in 2020, where Democrats voting, rather Republicans voting same day. So those numbers came in a little later than some of the early vote counts and vice versa out in the West. But, you know, it is interesting. One thing we don't give Donald Trump credit for is the fact that since he has been in our lives politically for the last decade, the voter turnout in this country has increased dramatically. 16, 18, 20, 22, and now it looks like 24. He is the master of the get out the vote, and he is trying this time to do it with young people and young men who aren't likely to get out regularly. But he is very, very good at this get out the vote drive, and he's turned it over to Elon Musk, but, you know, he doesn't really need much help. He's very good at it himself.
Just a minute, Rick. If Donald Trump wins tonight, this will be a very loud message about early voting in the Republican Party and a huge win for the RNC. Who got the party's arms around this?
You know, I think it started a couple of years ago when the party invested heavily in voter registration. We've seen massive voter registration increases with Republicans in these swing states. Arizona went from 120,000 advantage to 300,000 advantage in this election cycle. Very similar increases in Pennsylvania. So when you have more registered Republicans to turn out, it advantages you at the front end. Then on top of that, I do think Jeannie's got a good point. I don't think the Republicans that support Donald Trump need a lot of effort. They are low propensity voters. In other words, they don't show up to vote in every election. So they're a questionable group, but they show up when Donald Trump's on the ballot, and that's what got undercounted in 2016 and 20.
We'll find out about 2024. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, our signature political panel. Thank you, and we'll have more with them in the next hour of Balance of Power. But just ahead, we'll speak with Democratic Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois. He'll be with us here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
The top names in business are on Bloomberg.
I've made so many mistakes in my investment career. One of them was I sold all my NVIDIA, probably in somewhere between 800 and 950. I think it's 1,300 on that stock now. I own none, and I own none the last 400 points. It was a big mistake.
Nobody covers business like Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
I will show you how to get the best funding for your startup idea. Let's get started. Here's the deal. If you have an amazing startup idea and need funds to fuel it, we're here to help. Simply send us a video where you explain your idea. Make it clear, concise, and compelling. Hook us in with your passion and vision. Don't forget to include your contact details so investors can reach out directly. This is your chance to shine and get your idea in front of people who can make it a reality. Imagine turning your startup dream into a thriving business. It all starts with that one simple step. So what are you waiting for? Grab your phone, hit record, and let your idea fly. The future of your startup could be just one video away. Remember, be clear, be passionate, and most importantly, be you. We can't wait to see what you've got. Let's get funded now.
Market open as we bring you the first trades across Europe.
We'll debate the most important stories and what will drive the big investment decisions throughout the morning. I'm Guy Johnson.
I'm Kriti Gupta.
And I'm Anna Edwards. Join us every weekday morning for the opening trade, live at 7 a.m. here in London.
Only on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Bloomberg Surveillance covers the latest in global markets and the political events that influence your world. Join Jonathan Farrell, Lisa Abramowitz, and Anne-Marie Hordern only on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Asia is at the forefront of some of the world's biggest stories. I'm Chevrian in Tokyo.
And I'm Heidi Stroud-Watts here in Sydney, where the trading day begins. We're here in the center of all the action to get you set up with the numbers, news, and knowledge you need for the day ahead.
The demand is indeed recovering. We've been waiting for this moment.
The opportunity of a century.
Join us on Bloomberg The Asia Trade. Weekdays only on Bloomberg TV. Context changes everything.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. We'll call it a special edition. Happy Election Day. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons, and it's great to have you with us here as we work our way through the stages leading up to actual vote counting, polls closing a bit later on. Of course, our special coverage will start 5 p.m. Eastern time, and we're here for the duration. Kaylee, we're talking so much about the horse race, about the states, about lanes. We have to remember the issues in this campaign. Based on our polling, the economy is still #1, but remarkable, especially in the last drop we got from Siena and the New York Times, abortion creeping up to challenge the economy in some constituencies as the #1 issue in this election.
Well, and an important reminder that abortion is on the ballot in 10 states today, including states like Florida, for example, where we're watching a Senate race that is perhaps tighter than expected. And it is, of course, the first presidential election that we are seeing since the Dobbs decision and the overturning of Roe versus Wade. And it raises the question specifically of what kind of turnout driver it will be, considering the force we saw it to be in the midterms in 2022 and in special elections that have followed.
We know that this is an issue with a lot of potency. It's unquantifiable what the impact will be on the outcome. As we heard both campaigns lean into this issue on this campaign cycle. Let's listen.
Who, when he was president, hand-selected 3 members of the United States Supreme Court with the intention that they would undo the protections of Roe v. Wade. And they did just as he intended, and there are now 20 states with Trump abortion bans, including bans that make no exception for rape or incest.
Every Democrat, every Republican, liberal, conservative, they all wanted this issue to be brought back to the states where the people could vote.
Joining us now for more here on Balance of Power is Democratic Senator of Illinois, Dick Durbin, who chairs the Senate Judiciary Committee. Senator, happy Election Day. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm not sure your degree of confidence at this hour of Kamala Harris's ability to win this election, but if she does so, to what extent do you think the Dobbs decision in the Supreme Court will have played a role in that?
I think it's a major factor. I can just tell you, it motivates not just women to vote for Kamala, but a lot of men are joining in the ranks. And I see it with younger voters, too. They look at the actual cases of these women facing miscarriages, trying to find competent physicians in states where there are criminal penalties being threatened, and they understand that they don't want to be in that position. It doesn't sound like America to them, and it doesn't sound like it to me either.
Well, how are you feeling about things going into this election day, Senator? You've had a couple of them in your career. Illinois is not a swing state. It's not going to be one of the states likely to decide the balance of power in Washington, on Capitol Hill, or the next president. So where are you looking?
Well, I'll tell you what I'm looking for, and I've seen it this last weekend and before. We have literally hundreds, if not thousands, of Illinois volunteers who are going into Wisconsin to help Tammy Baldwin, into Michigan to help Alyssa Slotkin, into Pennsylvania to help Bob Casey, and the bottom line, to make sure that Kamala is elected president. These are real volunteers who care and are making personal sacrifices to help. I don't know what's going on the other side. There's no evidence of this similar undertaking. And you can't buy this kind of support. It's like comparing mom's apple pie to something you bought at a store. It just isn't the same thing. These folks really care, and if we do well in the blue range, the blue wall that they talk about here, I think it'll be because of this factor.
Well, as you raise the likes of incumbent Senators Tammy Baldwin and others who are facing tough re-election fights today as well, Senator, it raises the question of, even if Kamala Harris is able to pull off this victory, the prevailing wisdom is that you will become a member of the minority, that the Republicans will be able to flip the Senate as they only need to pick up net 2 seats. How would Washington work in that scenario? Where are the areas for cooperation?
That's a very good question, but I'm not going to concede your point that it's going to be a Republican Senate. We need 1 or 2 breakthroughs, and I can point to the states, you can too, that are possibilities. If, God forbid, the Republicans take control of the Senate and Kamala is our president, it's going to be a matter of negotiating questions like filling vacancies in judgeships and working together. I hope we can find that common ground.
Well, how much, Senator, then, will the top of the ticket help to determine the balance of power in the U.S. Senate? When we look at some of the Senate races in the blue wall states, for instance, how close they are, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, will the presidency help to decide the balance of power in your chamber?
Well, I think you addressed that earlier in the program. Some years it appears that it helps and some it hurts. I will just tell you that those 3 senatorial candidates and many others we talked about certainly have a strong record and a strong message to bring to the voters. Kamala's put together an amazing campaign in a little over 100 days that she's been the nominee. And I think the fact that she's inspired so many volunteers to go door to door in these states is going to make a definitive difference in these Senate races as well.
Well, as we watch all of this and the issues voters will be considering as they make their choices up and down the ballot, Senator, do you feel that the Harris campaign has done an adequate job addressing all of them? We obviously have heard a lot of her argument around reproductive freedom, especially casting Trump as a threat to democracy, talking about the economy, yes, but so too has Donald Trump, who has cast a lot of blame for the last 4 years and the inflation people have experienced on her and this administration. Same goes for the border. Are those the issues that she risks losing on if that's how it turns out tonight?
I don't think so, and I'll tell you why. From the beginning, Kamala has made the economy the issue. That's what the voters are saying, and she's backing them up by saying that'll be a high priority in her administration. But I'll also tell you, when she talks about the management style of Donald Trump, the question about the future of our democracy is at stake here. He's a candidate who's running and basically says, if I lose, it means that there was cheating and somebody stole it from me. He's stuck with that story for 4 years, the big lie. This is an even bigger lie if he does in that similar circumstance. So I think she's talking about our democracy, which is a fundamental issue at stake in this election.
Well, with that said, Senator, and based on your perch on the Judiciary Committee, Donald Trump appointed over 200 federal judges in his term. What would a Trump 2.0 mean for the U.S. judiciary?
Well, that's a good question. Under the rules of the Senate, for example, we have something called a blue slip, which means that both parties and their senators have quite a bit of say as to whether a nominee is going to move forward. So there has to be compromise in that regard. But I will tell you that Donald Trump, with the help of Democrats, had 234 nominations filled in his 4 years. We have filled 213 under President Biden and have another 20 plus on the calendar for the remainder of the year. So we can match him. I hope we do.
Well, if we consider as well the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court, Senator, there is a chance the next president will have some vacancies to fill. Would a President Harris have difficulty doing so depending on what the Senate majority looks like?
Well, it is a simple majority in the Senate when it comes to filling the Supreme Court vacancies. And that's why Trump was able to put 3 anti-choice justices on the court. If we're going to move forward and the circumstances you're describing with President Harris and a Republican Senate, there will have to be compromises made. It's the only way we can pass something, even by majority in the Senate.
Senator, last time we sat down with you was in Chicago for the Democratic National Convention. And one of the big storylines going into the DNC was the protest vote that we saw materialize in the primaries, the uncommitted vote that Joe Biden withstood and faced in many cases from Arab American voters and others who were not happy with, many progressives not happy with the policy in Israel. Expectations for widespread protests at the DNC never materialized, though, and I wonder if you see that being a risk tonight for Kamala Harris or if this is a media narrative.
There are so many elements that go into this decision-making process, but the fear at the outset was that there would be a boycott of support of Democratic candidates over Middle Eastern issues. I think once Donald Trump was articulate in his own way as to where he stood, people realize there's too much at stake to lose this race over that issue. It'll affect some voters for sure, but I think by and large we understand that Kamala Harris has a rational, thoughtful approach to this, which wants to end the conflict soon and help on the humanitarian side as quickly as possible.
Any Election Day rituals, superstitions you want to share with us, Senator?
There's a great delicatessen in Chicago called Manny's, and I'm on my way there now. I'll be every Election Day for the last 20 plus years. I've gone there, and I'm looking forward to corned beef sandwiches.
Well, that sounds good. I hope you have a great lunch, sir. Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois, we thank you, as always, for the time. We're also watching, of course, how markets are moving on this Election Day. This is a big part of the story for us here on Bloomberg, and we turn to Bloomberg Markets correspondent Abigail Doolittle for more on this. You wouldn't think it was a contested election with the way the markets are moving today, Abigail. What do you think?
You wouldn't at all, given the fact that you have the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ both up more than 1%. For the S&P 500, this is the best day in about 6 weeks. We have the index at session highs. We've had more recently these small moves up and down, the churn on the uncertainty. So when we connect today's move to the intersection between business and politics, one observation could be a potential Donald Trump administration could be harsh on big tech. Big tech is driving today's move, so that might be a little bit of a nod against Donald Trump. On the other hand, when we take a look at the Trump trade over the last 3 months and basically the amount of time since VP Kamala Harris has been in the race, well, it's been doing pretty well. That tech index is higher, so again, you could have that interpretation around Donald Trump. You have the solar ETF in a nod toward Kamala Harris, but take a look at Bitcoin, take a look at DJT, both of these are higher. So market's a little bit mixed, but that Trump trade that everybody has been talking about really pretty strong into today.
Well, as we consider these trades, Abigail, I know you always keep a close eye on volatility. That could go for both the equity market and the bond market with the MOVE index. What signals is it sending today?
It's interesting. So we do have heightened volatility. That VIX is above a 20, and that does signal uncertainty on the part of investors. Now, relative to the VIX, it's at some of the higher levels that it's been at more recently. Some could say that this is investors taking advantage of the uncertainty, candidate agnostic agnostic, that they're just trying to make money off of this volatility. However, there are some other folks on the street, including Steve Sosnick over at Interactive Brokers, who yesterday told me that he sees a lot of big institutions hedging. That's why on Monday, the put to call ratio, those bearish options versus bullish options at the highest level since 2020. So this is not unusual for an election cycle, but right now that VIX coming back in. So investors seem to be a little bit calm, surprisingly, on this election day.
All right,
Abigail, what are we going to be in for tonight in the overnight session if we have no race call?
Well, if there's no race call and there's any sense that there could be a contested election, you could see the futures go very negative. Back in 2000, between, I believe, let's call it 12 a.m. of the day after election through the bottom in December, stocks down sharply. Investors don't like uncertainty. That is certainly uncertainty investors wouldn't like. And at that point, you'd probably see that VIX spike back higher.
All right, Bloomberg Markets correspondent Abigail Doolittle, thank you so much. And Joe, as Abigail talks about the kind of calm we might be seeing, I guess it raises the question of how calm everyone is feeling on this election day, keeping in mind there's not much more that can be done at this point. The arguments have been made. The ground game has been at work for months, and now it's just a matter of how many people show up and cast their vote.
Well, that's absolutely right. There's no more cramming for the test. Although it's interesting to consider the positioning for volatility in either direction. We've seen market fits in both directions. When Trump was leading or Harris was perceived to be leading, there's going to be money to be made either way. We just have no idea which one that will be.
And coming up, we're going to talk to someone who knows a lot about financial markets. In fact, he'd like to be the next chair of the Financial Services Committee if the Republicans can retain the majority in the House. Congressman French Hill of Arkansas will join us next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
In case you missed it, on Bloomberg Crypto.
Voters want to see legislation on market structure. They want to see standards enacted in legislation for stable coins. The Harris campaign, like the Trump campaign, understands that 52 million Americans want to see crypto in their future, and that it's critically important that any new administration address those concerns and proactively, productively engage with legislation that's now pending in the Congress and rulemaking that is long overdue to provide people with the stability and clarity that this market requires.
There's one thing I feel very confident about, and that is the Biden administration's approach to regulation of the crypto industry. That is coming to an end for sure. And I think no matter where this plays out at the presidential level, we'll have a more constructive engagement with this industry. It's a critical industry. It's an innovative technology, and I think the United States should be at the forefront and leading.
Don't miss the next Bloomberg Crypto.
You are also an owner, I should have pointed out, of 3 major sports teams.
That's right.
And you were the first woman, as I understand it, the first woman to own 3 major, have a stake in 3 major sports teams. Is that right?
Yes, and we'll say African American.
You were approached by the owner then of the, I guess, the Washington Wizards and the Washington Caps about maybe buying the Washington Mystics, which is the women's basketball team. And what did you say?
Well, first of all, it was Abe Pollin. He did come to me and Susan O'Malley, and they said, Abe Pollin says, look, I want you to be the face of the Washington Mystics. And I said, what do you mean be the face of? He says, I want you to buy this team. His health was failing. And I have to tell you, and a lot of women can understand this, we never get these opportunities. So that was the first thing that struck me, and I was flattered. I was really flattered. I said, well, Abe, what are the financials on this? And he handed them to me. He says, well, they're not making money. But I was still intrigued about team ownership.
Season is here.
Third quarter earnings season, as we've been talking about, really in high gear.
Bloomberg is first to break the numbers.
We have some big earnings after the bell. Earnings from Caesars crossing the Bloomberg terminal.
Mondelez is reporting Reddit, AMD, Snap.
Let's keep the conversation going. With the smartest insights.
The bar keeps getting higher. 20% growth rate, when your comps get tougher, how much can you beat and raise?
Continuing coverage on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Good morning from our world headquarters in New York. I'm Manus Credit.
And I'm Danny Berger. Let's set your agenda.
Bloomberg Brief delivers the market news, data, and analysis you need live every weekday, only on Bloomberg. Context changes everything. Names that move markets are on Bloomberg.
At the moment, we are not totally unhappy with what we see. It looks very much that inflation is on the right track of disinflation. You know, we come from very high numbers, as high on average for the whole of the euro area as 10.6%. And the latest reading we had for the inflation in September was 1.7.
Nobody covers business like Bloomberg.
Bringing you up-to-the-minute business news whenever and wherever it happens. I'm Anne-Marie Herder in Ukraine, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. We are live from our global headquarters in New York on this election day. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons, and it has all come down to this, the day of voting, although voting has been going on for weeks now in many states. More than 83 million Americans had already cast a ballot coming into today, but of course, it really does all come down to this. Not only are they choosing who they would like to see as the next president of the United States, but also choosing people to represent them in Congress. The balance of power is also up for grabs.
Yeah, we're going to be watching a lot of swing states for both presidential and down ballot races, but there are other states that are in the mix tonight, Kaylee, as you well know, that we're going to be spending time on. Ohio, Montana, we've been watching very closely. There are also some outliers that have been maybe more fun to talk about than might turn into real results. And you know, I'm talking about Texas when I say that. Something that Julie Fine has been ahead of the curve on for some time. Is Ted Cruz in danger, or is it just another media narrative? I guess we'll find out later.
Well, let's check in with Texas now. Bloomberg's Texas Bureau Chief Julie Fine is joining us live from Dallas. So obviously, Julie, you warned us a long time ago that this race would be one to watch. What's the feeling like on the ground this election day about Ted Cruz's future?
Well, I mean, Ted Cruz has a very solid base here. His base is confident that he will be reelected for his third term. I must tell you, though, Colin Allred is giving him a run for the money. Literally, he outraised him, raised $80 million in this race. Now, conventional wisdom says it is difficult to win the state of Texas as a Democrat. But what they're hoping is there are more than 1.5 million new voters since Ted Cruz ran last time. I think Democrats are hoping that can make a difference for them. But again, you know, this is a rough one for Democrats to win. They have not won statewide office in 30 years. They are hopeful. Colin Allred has run a strong campaign. He campaigned very differently than Beto O'Rourke. So tonight they do have hope that they could flip the Lone Star State with this Senate seat.
Yeah, this story has become a bit of a novelty in covering the final throes of this election, Julie. The fact of the matter is the narrative going into the voting today is that Republicans will take control of the U.S. Senate. And from your view in Texas, that wouldn't be too much of a stretch. We will also go into, in that world, a new leadership battle. Of course, regardless of who owns the Senate, knowing that your own John Cornyn in the state of Texas is in the running to be the next Republican leader.
You know, I spoke to Senator Cornyn. He was actually in Dallas last week. He was at an event, and I asked him, I said, listen, you know, you are running for a new position. Is there any chance for bipartisanship after what we've seen recently? Because you know people will be looking at him for that. And he says there are issues that he thinks there can be agreement on. Now, I mean, it's been no secret John Cornyn interested in leadership for some time. He's been campaigning with other Senate candidates. He spent some time with Ted Cruz here as well. So he is definitely interested in that position and hopeful.
Well, and then there's a giant question around the leadership in the House, Julie, considering it may be that the Republicans lose the majority and become a minority, and then therefore the future of the current speaker, Mike Johnson, is very much in question.
Yeah, it's very much in question. I mean, you just spoke about it earlier. The balance of power may very well shift. It may be the same balance of power, but the House will be taken over by Democrats. This is something that Democrats have high hopes about, especially you're looking at some of the races in New York, the race in Nebraska and California. They have hope that they can flip those seats and do it to maintain the balance of power in the United States Congress.
You said it. Bloomberg's Julie Fine. Thank you so much, Julie, for setting us up with our eyes on Texas, and we widen our lens now with Republican Congressman French Hill of Arkansas. Congressman, it's great to see you. Happy Election Day. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. You've been living on the road a bit lately, helping to campaign for Republican candidates in New York, in Michigan, Ohio, and California. Give us your view from the ground.
Well, Joe, Kaylee, great to be with you. Happy Election Day. Look, our candidates are being outspent dramatically, but they have outstanding resumes. They're working hard, and they have terrific ground games. And I'm seeing President Trump do well in his polling in some of these key swing districts in those states: Michigan, Ohio, upstate New York, California. So while we have some tough races around the country, I think we're in a position to actually pick up seats net. And so I'm looking forward to a victory over the next few days. I don't say tonight because I think we've still got to count votes in this country, and that's tough.
Well, Congressman, as you consider the prospects of retaining the majority, is that a prerequisite for that, Donald Trump winning the presidency? Do you think Republicans can keep hold of some of these contested seats with a Kamala Harris victory?
Hey, great question. But, you know, we picked up seats in 2020 when President Trump lost and President Biden was elected. We picked up seats in 2022. And that's because we have great candidates running in both red and blue districts in both red and blue states. And our majority in 2022 went through our candidates in California and New York. I think we'll hold those seats. I think we could even pick up a seat or two in those locations. And then look at Scranton, PA, a hard-fought battle up in northeast Pennsylvania. That's a shot where I think we could pick up a seat if President Trump does well there. So if President Trump has a big night tonight, I think it would expand the Republican majority. But I have confidence in the hard work, financing, and ground games of our candidates to do well in this closely contested presidential race.
We usually spend time talking with you about monetary and fiscal policy and your broader view on the economy, Congressman, when you're with us with, of course, your background as a banker and your service on the Financial Services Committee. I want to talk about the closing arguments from these two candidates, Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, the rhetoric that we've heard and the perceptions about the way they would handle the economy. Here's a taste.
Build an opportunity economy.
You would have a surplus.
Donald Trump's plan would actually explode the deficit.
They started spending money like drunken sailors. They spent so much money, it was so ridiculous.
I will make it a top priority to bring down costs and increase economic security.
There's tremendous waste, fraud, and abuse in our country. We're going to bring companies and jobs in at levels that you've never seen.
When the middle class is strong, America is strong. We will lower the cost on everything from health care to groceries.
Congressman Hill, if expectations are right and we have a split Congress, what could be a Democratic-led House and Republican-led Senate, are we not overstating the impact that the executive has on the overall economy?
Well, we've had that for years where both voters and I think some presidents think they have way too much influence over the whole direction of a $30 trillion economy. But here's the bottom line, is that when you look at households in America, 50% of households, by many estimates, are worse off than they were in January 2021. The cost.
Seems like we're having a little bit of difficulty with Congressman Hill's connection there. We'll work on that. But Joe, it of course is a conversation we've been having for months now as we've assessed, for example, the estimates from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget about what would happen to the deficit under these different economic proposals. Could be north of $15 trillion in their median estimate under what Donald Trump has proposed when it comes to the bevy of tax cuts that he says he would offset using higher tariffs.
Yeah, and of course, look, Donald Trump is going to need Congress to get a lot of his tax proposals through tariffs he can probably handle on his own, at least to some extent through executive action. Kamala Harris's entire economic agenda would ride on a sympathetic Congress, and no one is predicting that right now.
Well, that's certainly true. So we go back to a member of Congress now, Congressman French Hill of Arkansas, still with us. Sorry about the technical difficulty, Congressman, but you were just making the point of the difficulty of getting a lot of these campaign promises to become reality when you don't have complete control of both chambers. So of all of the rhetoric we have heard from both candidates on the campaign trail, their ideas about taxes and the like, what is likely to happen through a bipartisan solution, no matter who is in control?
Well, I think members of Congress have to recognize in both political parties that a 6% annual budget deficit is too high. We have to work with the executive branch to bring down that spending like drunken sailors that was referenced by former President Trump. That should be a top priority, and preserve the growth features in our tax code. The Democrats and Vice President Harris are proposing huge tax increases. I don't think that's how we sustain economic growth, which is an essential feature to balancing our budget. We have to have economic growth.
So what are you watching tonight, Congressman, as you take a look across the country? As we already mentioned, you've been on the ground in some of these states. A lot of people don't think that we will know which party controls the House of Representatives for days. Are you among them?
Well, I think you have some states where it's going to be hard to count the votes in a speedy way, like California, for example, but that's one place where I'm watching closely. The race to replace former Congresswoman or retiring Congresswoman Katie Porter in Orange County. Scott Ball is the Republican candidate. He has an outstanding ground game. He's worked hard. He narrowly lost to her last time, and the Democratic candidate he's up against this time is a flawed one. So I'm looking at Scott Ball as a potential pickup in the California races, and I think our candidates, from Young Kim to Michelle Steele to Mike Garcia to Ken Calvert to David Valadao to John Duarte, are all positioned to win in California, that blue state. And I really think that's the case in a number of locations around the country.
So clearly, Congressman, you are confident that the majority, you will stay a member of the majority. Does that mean that Mike Johnson will stay as House Speaker? There obviously will be a leadership election in quick succession once all of these results are in. What is the fate of him and the other members of Republican leadership?
I've never seen a leadership team work harder. Mike Johnson, Steve Scalise, Tom Emmer, Elise Stefanik, they've just done an outstanding job crisscrossing the country, hundreds of meetings, all 50 states campaigning for our candidates. If we win tonight,
Looks like things might be a little sticky in Arkansas. That's just the way it goes here. While we're talking live with some of our experts, we'll see if we can reconnect with Congressman French Hill. It's interesting, Kaylee, to hear from somebody who's actually been with the candidates. Yeah. There are a lot of assumptions that are made based on polling and people looking from the bubble in Washington, D.C. It's also part of his job to express confidence. But, you know, the way these races break in California will have a lot to do with who controls the House.
Yeah, and as we've been reminding our audience, it is the California races that ultimately could take the longest to call, not only because of the geographic location on the West Coast. The polls will close later tonight than a lot of the country just by nature, but also the way in which the degree to which Californians vote by mail, for example, could really escalate the time it takes in order to get get all those ballots counted, knowing that according to most poll watchers, or at least balance of power watchers, including the likes of the Cook Political Report or Sabato's Crystal Ball, really think there's only a handful of true competitive races. What, 22 to 26 is the range?
Right, about 1 in 10 here. And greetings to our balance of power watchers as well here on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's counterintuitive, though, because we're not talking about swing states, really, when it comes to the House. We're talking about the two bluest states, really, that we have, New York and California. And within them, we have Republicans sitting in districts that were won by Joe Biden. So that's going to be the big test tonight when we're looking at East Coast closings. The New York delegation will be a big part of that. A couple of races in Virginia as well that we might use as bellwethers. Well, we won't be able to call the House for some time. Bellwethers maybe about where the direction of momentum are going.
Yeah, a reminder that all 435 seats in the House of Representatives are up for grabs tonight. The number is obviously smaller for the Senate, 34 Senate seats, and it's really just 11 that we are watching. A lot of them, as we have mentioned, do also overlap with the battleground states we are watching for the presidential election, but there are others we are watching as well, including the Texas race we were just discussing with Julie Fine, Florida, where abortion and marijuana measures are on the ballot as well, which could put the incumbent Republican Rick Scott in a bit more danger than was previously expected. And you also have to look at Nebraska. A reminder to everyone, Nebraska is not a state that should be slept on tonight, in part because the blue dot, one congressional district in Nebraska that does allocate electoral votes based on congressional district, will be required, along with the blue wall, for one path of Kamala Harris to the presidency. But the other thing to watch in Nebraska is the Republican incumbent, Deb Fischer, up against Dan Osborne.
Exactly.
An independent.
It's been a great race to watch.
Yeah.
Unfold. And that's going to take some time as well. Where the candidates are, we're following them. We already saw Donald Trump dropping a ballot a bit earlier this hour. That's where we started our coverage today, where he was voting in Palm Beach. Donald Trump will be at an election night watch party in West Palm Beach, Florida. They're at the convention center tonight. He'll come from Mar-a-Lago to the convention center. Kamala Harris is in the nation's capital, which is pretty unusual for a presidential candidate to be holding a rally there. But she'll be at Howard University, and we will bring you the sights and sounds of these two election night headquarters in our special coverage later on Bloomberg.
Yep, and of course, all the while, we are watching financial markets as well on this election day that don't seem to be too bothered by the uncertainty we still have at this time. The S&P 500 up 1.2% at 5780. The NASDAQ 100 is up by about 1.5 percentage points. The 10-year yield up by about 6 basis points. We still have much more to go here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Plenty more ahead in the second hour of Balance of Power. We'll be joined by Martin Luther King III and Andrea Waters King of the Drum Major Institute next here on Bloomberg.
Season is here.
I know it's like your Super Bowl, right?
I can't wait. It's like opening presents in the morning.
All right, it will be exciting.
Nobody covers earnings like Bloomberg. CFOs are reshaping the C-suite. Bloomberg's chief future officer shines a spotlight on these dynamic leaders. DraftKings has become a top performer in the booming U.S. sports betting industry. CFO Alan Ellingson knows the company must stay focused on change and innovation to succeed.
We're in an evolving business. We're constantly evolving and tweaking our expectations for how things should be performing. We're constantly looking at things in different ways.
Watch Chief Future Officer, only on Bloomberg.
Key investors, top executives, global innovators. Join me for in-depth conversations with the biggest newsmakers on the day's top stories. Insight with Haslinda Onen, only on Bloomberg.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power.
From Bloomberg's world headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. It is Election Day. It all comes down to this as we watch to see if Donald Trump or Kamala Harris will be elected the next president of the United States. And it's a reminder to us all, Joe, that regardless of the outcome and how long it takes us to figure out what the outcome is, history could be made today. Either we have the 45th president also becoming the 47th president, becoming just the second president in history to serve 2 terms non-consecutively, or the U.S. could elect its first female president of the United States and a woman of color at that.
That's why we're here, and it could take some time for us to figure this out. Of course, we're not only talking about the presidential campaign, we're talking about the House and Senate. And based on our most recent history with voting, knowing that more than 80 million Americans have cast ballots, it could take some time to get there. But yes, it is Election Day. Happy Election Day, and thank you for spending part of it with us. We're going to have coverage straight through polls closing and races being called. That means no more campaigning, no more speeches. The candidates' closing arguments have been made.
My message to Americans tonight is simple. We do not have to live this way. We do not have to settle for weakness, incompetence, decline, and decay. We can fix every single problem our country faces and lead America, and indeed the whole world, to new heights of glory.
Look, the race is not over, and we must finish strong. So listen, here's the thing about the hard work. We like hard work. Hard work is good work. Hard work is joyful work. And make no mistake, we will win.
And we know that both candidates have been hard at work in the 7 battleground states that will ultimately decide the outcome of this election over its final days of the campaign. And we go now to one of them. Bloomberg's Anna Edgerton is with us from Raleigh, North Carolina. Anna, obviously North Carolina, a state that we have seen a lot of change in from 2020 to 2024, is a state that hasn't gone for a Democrat in the last several election cycles. What's the feeling like on the ground?
Well, of course, we are waiting for those results tonight. That's the big news that everyone is waiting for. I just spoke with Karen Brinson Bell. She's the executive director of the State Board of Elections. She gave us a bit of a timeline on what to expect as we watch results roll in. She said polls are set to close at 7:30. If there were any issues at individual polls, there would be the option to extend those hours. She said that doesn't look like it'll be the case at this point. She said she expects 98% of votes to be counted tonight, and that should be enough for networks to make calls if the results are clear. If the results are close, she cautioned that we could be in for days of waiting for a result from North Carolina.
Just have a headline crossing the terminal that we should mention here, Kaylee. This is coming from Axios. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has fired Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, knowing that they did not agree on a lot of the actions in Gaza, or for that matter, to the northern border. This is something that that we are just now getting an official statement on Benjamin Netanyahu firing his defense minister. Of course, our policy in Israel, the Biden administration's policy, that of the United States, has been a major factor in this campaign. And in North Carolina, as we spend time with Anna Edgerton, so too has been the scandal surrounding the lieutenant governor. There's a lot of talk about ticket splitting there, Anna. Will that be the narrative tonight?
Yeah, and North Carolina voters have split their tickets in the past. I heard from Josh Stein last night. He's the Democrat who's running against Mark Robinson, the Republican candidate for governor, and he's very confident at this point that Democrats will retain the governor's mansion. Although he supporters implored Democrats to get out and vote down ballot. They really want to break the Republican supermajority in the legislature because that would give Democrats a little bit more of a leeway to use that Democratic governor to set policy.
Anna, thanks for being with us. Bloomberg's Anna Edgerton live in North Carolina as we turn now to Georgia. And, of course, another important swing state. Our Atlanta bureau chief, Brett Pulley, joins us now for more. Brett, this is going to be one of the biggest prizes, of course, in the country when it comes to the swing states and certainly along the East Coast. What are you hearing on the ground today?
Well, the latest that we're hearing, a little while ago, the Secretary of State here made a statement. He updated us on the election and also assured people that there were 2 earlier bomb threats, and he said that those were, they think, Russian hoax, and related to a Russian hoax, I should say, and that those polls have reopened. The Secretary of State also said that he expects all votes to be counted by 8 p.m. at about 99% by that time. There's a new rule here in the state that requires that all the precincts have the voting completed within an hour of the polls closing at 7 p.m. So if all goes accordingly, we could very well know who's won here in Georgia, certainly earlier than we did in 2020.
Well, and of course, that would be something that really could shift the trajectory of the night as Georgia brings with it 16 electoral votes. Could be a critical piece in the puzzle as they race to 270 here. Brett, walk us through the specific areas and demographics we should be looking at in Georgia this evening. Where are you going to be eyeing for signs of high turnout among different groups of voters?
Well, you know, clearly a big prize here is Fulton County. That's where Atlanta is situated. It's also the biggest metropolitan area in the state. And then some of the other areas such as Macon, Savannah, Augusta will be big indicators. But, you know, this time around it was very interesting. Both candidates made sure that they spent time in some of the state's rural areas as well. The Democratic candidate, Kamala Harris, typically the Democratic candidate has not spent a lot of time outside of those urban areas. This time she did, so there was opportunity there. And the former president as well spent a fair amount of time in Fulton County and some other areas, heavily focusing advertising on men in those areas, black men and white men. And so I think he saw opportunities in some areas that typically he may not have ventured into. You know, really since 2016, former President Trump has not fared that well here. Of course, he lost in 2020, and then after that, famously, allegedly asked to fine 11,000 votes, which led to criminal indictments. And then, of course, Georgia is also the place where President Biden had his meltdown during the debate, which led to Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket. So Georgia's a big prize.
Indeed. Thank you for covering it for us on this election day. Bloomberg's Brett Pulley, we appreciate it. And we do just want to reiterate the breaking news we have gotten as it pertains to the Middle East. According to Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu's office, he has fired the Israeli Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant. According to a statement, Netanyahu said there were significant gaps between him and Gallant over the ongoing war in Gaza. They tried but failed to bridge those gaps. And Netanyahu said the enemies benefited from the gaps between him and the the defense minister. It will remain to be seen how this alters the course of Israel's ongoing war with Iranian proxies, Joe. But of course, this is a feature in this election as well, an issue that has plagued specifically those on the Democratic ticket. First Joe Biden, and now, of course, Kamala Harris, as we watch to see how this affects the Arab American and Muslim American vote, especially in key battleground states like Michigan.
That's right. Look, it's going to be interesting to see if that uncommitted vote materializes this evening in those areas, knowing this dogged Joe Biden on the primary trail. Obviously, Kamala Harris did not go through the primary cycle, but she's been continually interrupted by hecklers at her events, pro-Palestinian protesters. We'll see if that becomes a reality in the voting.
Yeah, and of course, that's just one of the demographic groups we are paying attention to. There are many others as well, some of which Brett Pulley were just touching on, including in states like Georgia, black voters and black men in particular. This is, of course, something that Kamala Harris was questioned about earlier on in this cycle when she was interviewed by journalists at the NABJ.
I think it's very important to not operate from the assumption that black men are in anybody's pocket. Black men are like any other voting group. You got to earn their vote. So I'm working to earn the vote, not assuming I'm going to have it because I am black.
Joining us now for more from Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. Bureau, our two special guests, Martin Luther King III, chairman of the Drum Major Institute and son of the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and Andrea Waters King, president of the Drum Major Institute. Welcome to you both. Thank you for being here on Bloomberg on this election day. Martin, if I could just begin with you. Kamala Harris has not, throughout her campaign, leaned into the historic nature of her candidacy. Not only that she would be a woman potentially elected president, but a black and South Asian woman at that. What does it mean to you as you have spent so much of your life fighting for equality?
Well, I think it demonstrates that people are very concerned about the issues, not necessarily the ethnicity. And the fact that we've had a black president and not a woman, that is extraordinarily important. However, I think staying on the issues is what people, how is my life going to change under your leadership? And I think she's demonstrated what she intends to do if she becomes president of the United States.
Andrea, do you agree? Because the potential to make history is very compelling to some voters here when you back off this race. That's been a major backdrop since Kamala Harris reached the top of the ticket. Or is it, in fact, kitchen table issues that drive people today?
I think it's a combination of both. Obviously, as a black woman and as the mother of a black daughter, it is something that we are extremely proud of, to have the vice president, hopefully soon to be president, heading our country. Also, we're also at a time when women have progressively lost rights. And so I think that you're seeing women coming together and standing together. And in fact, we really might be the deciding vote in this election today.
Well, it certainly could be women that ultimately make or break this thing for Kamala Harris. It all, though, will depend on turnout, and that is what both of these candidates, Andrea, have been really fighting for in the final stretch here. Are you confident that voters are going to be getting off the couches and participating in this election?
Absolutely. We have spent so many weeks and months ourselves out with the canvassers. We were just in North Fulton on Friday. And I'll tell you, the excitement that we are seeing is something that, since the announcement of this candidacy up until now, is something that's continuing to grow. And we saw that in the numbers of early voting, certainly in Georgia, breaking records. And we also are seeing that in early voting around the country. I do think that we're going to continue. That will uphold today.
Mr. King, I wonder your thoughts over the past couple of months, some of the rhetoric that we've heard on the campaign trail. We just opened with comments that Kamala Harris made before the NABJ. Donald Trump had some comments to the NABJ as well that questioned her racial identity, and it's a narrative that he has pushed through the course of this cycle. Some have called it corrosive, some have called it dated, some say it doesn't matter. What do you think?
Well, I think that it should be irrelevant, the ethnicity, again, of a person. It should be. We maybe haven't gotten there with some people, but as it relates to, black men specifically, black men, I believe, are going to support overwhelmingly the candidacy of the vice president to help her become the president, along with a vast coalition of others.
But Donald Trump has spent a great deal of time vying for the vote of black men and talking about how he is doing better with them than Republicans have in the past. And considering, Mr. King, that you said issues are ultimately what matters here, what issue is it that there is a disconnect with at least some black men and Kamala Harris and the ideas she has put forward?
So I think when you talk about the prospect of supporting small and disadvantaged businesses, when you talk about getting a loan that might be forgivable, I think when you talk about the fact that reducing prices, I mean, black men, like every man, wants to be able to take care of their families. Every woman wants to be able to take care of their families. And when you talk about these bread and butter issues, I believe there is an opening there. There is support. I just think that at the end of the day, the vast majority of black people are going to be supportive of the vice president.
May I also add, we also are talking about someone who said that he won the last election. Mm-hmm. And we also are talking about someone who said that he had audiences, the largest in inauguration history, or audiences that were larger than the March on Washington, no matter what photo evidence stated to the contrary. So let's talk about the facts when they come out. Let's not necessarily take Donald Trump at his word.
Well, Andrea Waters-King, tell me how you would describe then some of the racial rhetoric that we've heard on the campaign, culminating with that massive Trump rally at Madison Square Garden that had jokes that we couldn't tell on the air.
Not only jokes that we wouldn't tell on the air, those are things that we teach our children that are wrong. Mm-hmm. I worked for many years monitoring hate groups and hate crimes such as the Ku Klux Klan, neo-Nazis, and skinheads. And it is very alarming for me to see the very rhetoric that we were researching at the time actually now being said from the annals of some of the highest levels and of power in our land. And also to not only see this type of these words that are being said, but also seeing those things being passed into laws. So it is very troubling, which is why I think that we're going to see, and we have seen, such a strong standing for unity in this country, for a path forward, for turning that page on the hate and the divisiveness of the past.
And let me add one thing, because the question is, what is sustainable? Most people understand when we are building a world of peace and justice and righteousness, if you're advocating vitriol, it is not sustainable. My dad would say, we must learn nonviolence or we may face non-existence. We don't want to face that. We're going to face building what my father and mother would say is the beloved community.
Well, and so much, sir, of what they were fighting for was the right to vote. And obviously, many more people, in part because of their work, do have the right to vote today. But given in the lead up to this election, some of the legal action we have seen, questions around who can and cannot be purged from voter rolls this close to an election, how ballots can be counted, which ballots are valid if there are mistakes. Do you have concerns about the right to vote being rolled back for at least some segments of the population?
I certainly always have concerns. I've always wondered why we purge people from voting, but yet we can drive as drivers forever, and you're never removed from the driving roles, if you understand the analogy. The fact is, you may not vote 1 year or 2 years, but you shouldn't be removed. You still have that right, but yet we orchestrate the kind of results that we want to see. And I think those who say, let's support the John Lewis voting rights bill, which all people need, not any one ethnic group, that's the right course. And the hope is that Kamala Harris wins, and in fact, the legislative bodies will pass that legislation for once and for all.
Andrea, there's an expectation that Democrats will take control of the House. Do you see some hope for the John Lewis voting rights bill in Washington if that happens?
Absolutely. We have been working for that federal legislation for years now, and we have confirmation from soon-to-be President Kamala Harris that that is something that she will push forward. I think with the power of the House behind her, that will become an ultimate reality. And, people have talked about the fact that, yes, there's been record turnouts. That does not mean that we do not need to secure federal voting rights once and for all. Our daughter has progressively lost rights since the day that she was born. The crowning achievement of voting, that was her grandparents' legacy, has been eroded. Yes, we've had great organizers, but we should not continue to fight that battle. Voting rights are birthrights and should be in this country.
I want to thank you both for an important conversation. With us in our Washington Bureau, Martin Luther King III, Andrea Waters King. Thank you for joining us today on Bloomberg TV and radio. Coming up, we'll have a lot more with Michael Whatley, chair of the Republican National Committee, as part of our coverage on this election day. From World Headquarters in New York, I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons. It's coming up next on Balance of Power, Bloomberg TV and radio.
In case you missed it, on Bloomberg Technology.
We're excited to really change the expectations for space companies, where you have this always-on, reliable, and frankly dynamic satellite connectivity that you would expect of your power grid.
Easier access to space means more demand for space, and that's the definition of an exponential growth function.
I think that's what's so exciting from a business perspective. If you can do it, you're one of a few numbers of organizations in the history who've actually pulled it off.
Don't miss Bloomberg Technology live every weekday.
As we spend some time here on the broader presidential race.
Let's focus in on European politics.
Makes you wonder how politics might play out.
The top names in business are on Bloomberg.
I've made so many mistakes in my investment career. One of them was I sold all my NVIDIA, probably in somewhere between 800 and 950. I think it's 1,300 on that stock now. I own none, and I own none the last 400 points. It was a big mistake.
Nobody covers business like Bloomberg. Context changes everything. Get your fixed income fix. Watch Bloomberg Real Yield every Friday right here on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
I'm Professor Hannah Fry, mathematician and writer. In this series, I will meet the companies, people, and pioneers transforming the world.
It's like the Jetsons meets the Flintstones.
Whatever future you dream of, if it affects us, I will explore it. The future is coming.
To the world of business, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons deliver news, insight, and analysis live 2 times a day every trading day. Balance of Power at 1 and 5 Eastern, only on Bloomberg.
It's the countdown to the market open as we bring you the first trades across Europe.
We'll debate the most important stories and what will drive the big investment decisions throughout the morning. I'm Guy Johnson.
I'm Kriti Gupta.
And I'm Anna Edwards. Join us every weekday morning for the opening trade, live at 7 a.m. here in London.
Only on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kaylee Lyons alongside Joe Matthew, live from Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York on this election day, which now, at least in some parts of the country, Joe, is more than halfway over. We will get the first poll closures in parts of Indiana and Kentucky at 6 p.m. Eastern time, less than 5 hours from now.
Yeah, we're counting down to results coverage, of course, special coverage here on Bloomberg TV and radio, knowing that more than 80 million Americans have already voted here. And I will tell you, despite the fact, Kaylee, that the polls are deadlocked, certainly at the top of the ticket, the market is whistling past the graveyard today. If they have anything to worry about in terms of uncertainty that follows this election night, the S&P 500 holding up 1%, the VIX is down 7%.
Yeah,
so
20
much
handle.
For the volatility.
I guess we'll wait and see what tomorrow brings, because that's when we're likely to get some real news about how this thing is going.
Well, exactly. And of course, we're going to be tracking the swing states here this evening. One of the first that we'll be watching on the East Coast is North Carolina, Kaylee. We just spoke with Brett down in Georgia, but North Carolina is a big prize as well, and it's one that's come with some noise in this cycle.
Well, certainly, because it's not just the presidency we are watching, but importantly, a gubernatorial race in which the Republican Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson is up against the Attorney General Josh Stein, and Robinson has been described to us by many as a problematic candidate for the Republican Party.
This is true. It's something that we talked about with Mick Mulvaney, the former acting White House Chief of Staff in the Trump administration, no stranger to North Carolina. Here's what he said.
Biden, where we had the highest inflation in 40 years. The bottom 50% of workers are getting crushed. I call it the 3 I's: inflation, interest rates, and immigration. And if you want more of that, then you should vote for it.
Biden wanted much higher taxes. Kamala Harris came in at 28% for tax rate for cap gains and 28% for corporation, and did not say a word and will not say a word about unrealized capital gains. And so I think she's completely different.
We'll get to what Mick Mulvaney told us, Scott Bessent and Mark Cuban there, with their views of the economic proposals coming from both campaigns. And it's an opportunity now to bring in Michael Whatley. We've been looking forward to talking with the chairman of the Republican National Committee. He's with us from the Washington, D.C. area at RNC headquarters. Mr. Chairman, welcome to Bloomberg TV and radio. I'd love to ask you, and we'll get to the situation in North Carolina and your expectations for what happens tonight. But broadly speaking, this is our opportunity to ask the chairman what he's hearing. I know you have people fanned out around the country looking at polls, looking at returns. Can you give us an update?
Yeah, what I would say is coming into Election Day, Republicans were really poised to have a fantastic day. When you look at voter registration numbers, you look at the early vote, the absentee ballot requests and returns, all of that put the Republicans in a great position to win. We had an outright lead in states like Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, and North Carolina, and we substantially narrowed the leads that Democrats typically have going into Election Day in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. So you put all of that together with a robust turnout on Election Day, that makes us feel fairly comfortable that we're going to have a good night tonight. As I told the president, if you're in a good position to win on Election Day, we just have to win on Election Day.
Well, and it becomes a question of how that win would happen, Mr. Chairman. What is the path you're most confident in at this hour? Does it run through the Sun Belt or the Rust Belt?
I think you need a combination of the two. Right now, what we're seeing is a good, solid lead for the Republicans in Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, North Carolina. We feel comfortable that we will be able to carry the day with those states, given our traditional, Election Day patterns. And then we would need, at that point in time, to just pick off one of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. We have small but durable leads in the polls in all of those states. Very solid performance during the early vote period. So we're very anxious and ready to go for those 3 states.
Would love to hear from the aforementioned Mick Mulvaney, Mr. Whatley, talking about North Carolina. He just got back from the state and described his trip across North Carolina, what he was seeing on the ground. Let's listen.
I drove from Raleigh, North Carolina to Charlotte this weekend through the back roads, and I got to tell you, I think you're going to see North Carolina go for Kamala Harris. I think Donald Trump is going to walk to Georgia, a win in Georgia, but may well lose North Carolina.
As the former chair of the state's Republican Party, Michael Whatley, what do you say to that?
I feel very good about North Carolina. The first time in the history of the state, Republicans actually have a lead coming out of the early vote, absentee vote period. The polling looks very, very solid. North Carolina's always been a purple state. It's always been a battleground state. It's a very tight. It was our most narrow win in 2020 for President Trump. But we do like the numbers, and we have a great team on the ground there.
We heard from former President Trump earlier today after he voted in Florida, suggesting that so far he thinks this election has been fair. He said that as of roughly noon today, Mr. Chairman, and the question is going to be what we hear from Donald Trump later on this evening. Do you expect, regardless of whether the final tally is in or not, that Donald Trump will be declaring victory by the end of tonight?
We'll just have to wait and see what those results look like.
But you're confident that he won't prematurely declare victory?
I would just have to say we will wait and see what those results look like. If we have fair, accurate, secure, and transparent elections, then we would be glad to acknowledge those and move forward.
Understood. Let's get into that for a moment, because we had a bomb threat turned out to be, according to Secretary of State Raffensperger in Georgia, a Russian hoax. What are you hearing around the country, Mr. Chairman? Is there funny business we should know about, or has this been a fair and safe election so far?
So far, so good. We obviously are very concerned about what we saw down in Atlanta, and think that the authorities took all the proper precautions to clear that voting location, conduct a sweep, realize that it was okay, and then allow voters to go back in. We also have seen, usual types of issues where a polling location didn't open exactly on time, or a machine didn't work, or ran out of ink in a toner cartridge, or something along those lines, which are going to be resolved very quickly, and we'll be able to move on with the process.
Well, and of course, as we watch the voting process play out, voters are not just selecting who they'd like to be president of the United States, but other candidates as well, including those that will represent them in the House of Representatives and the Senate. Mr. Chairman, there is only so much a President Trump could do without the cooperation of Congress. So as you look from your perch as the chair of the Republican National Committee, how are you feeling about the odds of flipping the Senate and retaining the House?
We feel very good about the Senate. At this point in time, we're going to win Montana. We're going to win West Virginia. That will give the Republicans 51 seats. We also feel very, very good about Ohio. And then you look at a combination of states in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, as well as Arizona and Nevada. Depending on what those overall numbers look like, we could have a very, very good night for the Republicans. When it comes to the House, similarly, we are in a position to be able to expand our majority there. Right now, it's a 2-seat majority. And if this election night goes as we currently are tracking, then hopefully we'll be able to pick up 4, 5, 6 seats there.
Well, Mr. Chairman, Donald Trump's been talking about you. He brought you up at a rally in North Carolina. Considering the stakes in this election, he said you better win. I want to get this right. You better win, or you won't be able to come back here. He doesn't win. He says he won't be at RNC, and he will no longer be in North Carolina. He'll be looking for a job. I know that there's probably some joking going on there, Mr. Chairman, but what kind of pressure are you feeling today?
What I feel right now is cautious optimism. We are very upbeat about where we are. The infrastructure that we have, the campaign staff, the RNC staff have worked seamlessly together. President Trump has been out there in every single battleground state multiple times over the course of the last several weeks. We had 3 events on Friday, 3 events on Saturday, 3 events on Sunday, and 4 events yesterday. And so nobody is outworking the president. We feel very good about where we are coming into Election Day, and right now we're very happy with what we're seeing on the ground.
All right. RNC Chairman Michael Whatley, thank you so much for joining us on this Election Day. We appreciate your time, sir. And as we hear confidence from the Republicans, we also heard yesterday some confidence from Democrats, specifically Democratic Congressman Jake Auchincloss of Massachusetts was on this program, Balance of Power, saying that he fully expects he will become a member of the majority.
I think Democrats are going to take back the House. I don't think it's going to be a blowout. Neither party would claim that at this point because of how polarized the country is right now. But I do think that Republicans' dysfunction in the 118th Congress, in which they had multiple rounds of infighting over their speaker choice, in which they brought the country to the verge of a debt default, in which they had to be really bullied into funding our allies, I think is going to speak to the swing voter in those 24 seats that are going to decide the majority, and it's going to give Hakeem Jeffries the gavel.
For more, we're joined now by a representative from the state that could help make or break the House majority, New York. Republican Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis of New York is with us now. So, Congresswoman, obviously we're seeing both sides projecting confidence on this election day. Perhaps that is not surprising. But when you look at your colleagues in your state in particular, how are you feeling about how tight these races have been coming in to Election Day? Are we going to see seats flip this evening?
Look, I think that every New York Republican has the good opportunity to keep their seats. I think that we're all going to make it through at the end of the day. But yes, some of these races have been extremely tight because they're in districts that Biden had won previously. I think the momentum that you're seeing, though, here in New York is in the Republican favor. Why? Because people are fed up with the one-party Democrat rule that has been so destructive in New York. Everything from high taxes to congestion pricing to the mass illegal migration, billions of our tax dollars being used to house gang members in luxury hotel rooms while they wreak havoc on our city. I think people have had enough, and if they've had enough, they need to send a strong message, not just to Kamala Harris, but to Chuck Schumer and to Kathy Hochul and to Mayor Adams. This is the day to do that.
Well, what is it about New York? When you look at some of the different districts that are at play here, Congresswoman, and happy Election Day, by the way, whether it's Laloda, Lawler, D'Esposito, the 4th district Joe Biden won in 2020 by 14 percentage points. Are you suggesting that New York voters prefer gridlock in Washington?
No, what I'm saying is that even though those districts were won by President Biden 4 years ago, they were flipped to Republican 2 years ago because people were unhappy with the direction that the Biden-Harris administration were taking the country. They're not happy that this administration chose to issue 60 executive orders that completely dismantled our border, that under their rules that Customs and Border Patrol agents are being directed to release people into our interior.
Then why are these races toss-ups? Shouldn't they be leading their Democratic rivals?
So again, they're toss-ups because again, these are districts that historically were Democrat districts that we flipped. So it's always going to be a tight race, and I think that you'll see these members prevail. I even think we could flip a seat in the Hudson Valley with Allison Esposito, who has a 20-year career with the NYPD. She ran as lieutenant governor with Lee Zeldin 2 years ago, where a gubernatorial ticket in New York State getting 40% of the vote. That tells me that New York is a purple seat. Purple state. We just need the people to vote at the maximum possibility. We still don't see 100% voter turnout, right, in New York. And I think showing how close those races were 2 years ago, where we flipped some seats, we delivered the majority for the House, and Lee Zeldin came so close to becoming elected governor, I think was a wake-up call for people that your vote truly does matter in New York, and that we are a purple state, not a blue state, as they say.
Well, so as we consider the outcome of the vote here, obviously, without knowing it at this time, we are looking ahead to next week when the Republican conference in the House will be having leadership elections. Congresswoman, how could the architecture of Republican leadership look different if it's the majority still or becomes the minority? What happens to Speaker Mike Johnson, for example?
So look, if we have the majority, I believe all of our leadership stays in place. If you're in the minority, then you lose a spot. And then that may be some shuffling that you would see going on. But I think that we're on track to keep the majority and expand our majority. I think it will be a small expansion of the majority, but we will keep the majority nonetheless, because people know that we're the ones who did the work, right? We passed legislation to actually secure the border, to reverse the anti-energy policies that have driven up inflation, the cost of food and energy in America. We're the ones who have been the ones that have really put a check into government spending. No more of these crazy omnibus massive bills that added trillions when the Democrats had control in the first 2 years. So I think that people want to see a balance, and particularly here in New York, and having a House majority does give us some sense of balance when we have Democrats controlling everything from the city council to the state legislature to all 4 spots in our statewide office.
If you keep your majority in the House, Congresswoman, and Mike Johnson remains your speaker, presumably in that world, would you work to repeal the CHIPS Act that was passed and pushed by the Biden administration, later passed by Congress?
Yeah, so the CHIPS Act had some issues with it. I don't think it needs to be repealed. I think it could be adjusted to make sure that all of the incentives are being used here in the United States. And one of the other issues with the inflation, they called it the Inflation Reduction Act. We called it the Inflation Expansion Act. That bill at 2 also gave a lot of incentives that ended up in communist China for EV batteries, and then subsidized, slave labor and child labor in the Congo. So I think there needs to be some adjustments to make sure that these things are actually being made here in the United States. I have similar legislation to the CHIPS Act that would incentivize production of pharmaceuticals here in the United States, which we desperately need because 80% of our pharmaceutical ingredients are coming from communist China and overseas. So I think the incentives to bring chips and all those sensitive supply chains home is important. If we can alter the legislation to make it better, then we should look at that. But certainly, I want to see these products being made here in the United States.
Congresswoman, great to have you back. Nicole Malliotakis of New York, thanks for being with us on this election day on Bloomberg TV and radio. As we reassemble our signature panel, Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, Republican strategist at the table here in New York, alongside Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University, our Democratic strategist. Great to have you both back. We just heard from 2 Republicans, Rick, the chair of the RNC, and of course, Congresswoman Malliotakis just there, speaking pretty optimistically about the House. That's going against the narrative, though, isn't it?
Well, the New York Congresswoman, she's right in the middle of ground zero. I mean, between New York and California, we can either sustain the Republican majority in the House or lose it. And so I think she's right about the idea that Republicans are getting stronger in New York, not weaker. We see a lot of trends toward even New York upping their vote for Donald Trump. There's all this talk about Donald Trump actually having as many popular votes as Kamala Harris, and that's not because of the targeted states. That's because of him doing better in places like California and New York. So that has to benefit our Republican down ticket members, too. So, yeah, I think that the House is probably going to be one of the most closely watched races tonight. The Senate seems baked for Republicans, but obviously all eyes are always on the presidential campaigns.
Well, and if you're considering where the market's eyes have been, Jeannie, by and large, they've been betting on divided government, that no matter who wins the presidency, there's going to be opposite parties controlling the House and the Senate. But if Republicans are feeling confident in New York and elsewhere, is there a likelihood that we could end up with a red sweep? If Trump wins the presidency, could he bring the House along with him?
It is certainly possible. And, we simply don't know at this time. But I do think that if you look, I agree with Rick on the Senate. It looks like that is going to go in the Republicans' direction. I think Democrats could take the House. It's going to be very close. I also don't think we are going to know for a few days, if not a week, because a lot of these competitive races are out in California, as Rick mentioned. We've also got one in Alaska. We've got the 5 in New York that are very competitive. So I don't know if you should be betting, if you're in the markets right now, that we're going to have a unified government. I think we can't forget that all of these projections are based on polling, and so they are subject to error, whether it's non-response bias, whether it's the way in which we as pollsters figure out who we're going to model to turn out. These are all things that are subject to error. So that's what makes it exciting for all of us, but I wouldn't place money yet on a red sweep.
We talked to the chairman, Michael Whatley, a short time ago about potential paths to victory for Donald Trump. When Kayleigh asked, is it the Rust Belt or the Sun Belt? He said it's a combination. Isn't that the answer for both?
Yeah, I think that's what they want it to be, right? Nobody wants to be pinned down. But, first thing that's going to happen tonight is we're going to get a peek into North Carolina and Georgia. Now, that's really important because, one, two key swing states. But, two, if either one of these candidates win both those states, and we'll know pretty soon tonight whether or not that's going to happen because they both have polls that close at 7 o'clock and at 7:30, it then gives them an option to lose Pennsylvania. If you lose Pennsylvania, you have to have North Carolina and Georgia to make up the electoral votes that you need. So if they split, that's another problem for anybody. Then it's like you got to win Pennsylvania to be the nominee. So I think that this will be the first time we see a real gelling of the strategy. Which path are you going to have access to walk down?
Well, and it's not just North Carolina and Georgia that the campaigns have told us to brace for almost full results from. It's Michigan as well, which does raise the question of whether or not we will have a sense before all of the states are in, Jeannie, as to whether or not there is still an open path for either of these candidates. Assuming, though, that someone doesn't win all three of those, and this could take days, what are you expecting the language will be for both of those candidates when they go speak at their parties? I won't call them victory parties or anything, but in D.C. and down in Florida, what are they going to say if it's still too close to call?
You know, I have my hope of what I hope they would say, which is let our fellow citizens that are running these polls count the ballots. I don't have confidence that that's what we're going to hear from Mar-a-Lago. The former president has already talked about the fact that if he doesn't win, then it will mean this thing was rigged and it was stolen. And, you know, he came out today. One thing I agree with him on is I think once this is over, we have to have a concerted conversation in this country about how to count ballots and administer our elections. Our friends in Europe do it much faster, much better, much less expensively. I mean, I could go on, you know, you know, I think we should look over there. Let's look at Florida. They count fast. There is no reason, the president is right, former president, in this country in 2024, we can't get our administration in better shape. So I think that's what we should focus on. But for today, I think we should say calm. Let's let our friends that are running these polls have the time they need to count.
Yeah, well, to hear from the Secretary of State in Georgia about a bomb threat, talking about a Russian hoax, he said, is what was really going on there. We talked about that with the RNC chair as well. Reminds us of how on edge a lot of people are about the way this is being executed today. That's a good moment, though, isn't it? When the Secretary of State comes out and says, no, this has been handled. This is a hoax.
Yeah, it's a good moment when the Secretary of State says that, but it's even better when Chairman Waitlist of the Republican Party says, yes, the Secretary of State, there you go. I accept his explanation. We're all on board with that. I mean, right now, everything seems calm. We're into the, you know, first 6 hours of voting around the country, and other than some of these kind of episodes, which reminds us about the pernicious influence of foreign actors in our own elections, it seems to be a fantastic day for voting. In other words, we don't have any real problems at the ballot boxes. There haven't been disruptions. Voters aren't, you know, saying that they're being turned away. I mean, that is a model election
Even the weather's
so far.
Good.
Yeah, knock on wood.
Well, and of course, it's not just about Election Day, though, Jeannie. There's going to be other dates on the calendar we have to look forward to, including, for example, when the actual electors cast their votes on December 17th, when Congress then has to certify them on January 6th, only for the president then to hopefully be inaugurated on January 20th. So once we're all through today, whether or not we know the outcome at the end of the day, how far are we really from this thing being over?
Well, given the way we run our elections, we've got a ways to go. And, you know, I think we can all remember before 2020 when not a lot of people paid attention to when the ballots were going to be open January 6th. And now it has become a day that we are a bit nervous about. And so it is a very big concern. I think one difference is the person currently in the White House is not running for president. So we have the benefit that somebody who is not sitting there is going to be, you know, in the White House, and unlike 2020, won't be able to go to the mall and you know, try to send a mob to Congress.
All right, Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis, our signature political panel. Thank you. And they, of course, will be with us throughout Election Day here on Bloomberg TV and radio, including in our special edition of Balance of Power, which will begin at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. As we are here on Election Day, the final arguments have been made to American voters who are now turning out to the polls. And Donald Trump, in his closing message, had this to say to Americans.
My message to Americans tonight is simple. We do not have to live this way. We do not have to settle for weakness, incompetence, decline, and decay. With your vote tomorrow, we can fix every single problem our country faces and lead America, and indeed the whole world, to new heights of glory.
We're joined now by Democratic Congresswoman and chair of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, Susan DelBene. Congresswoman, thank you so much for being with us. It is, of course, your job to help get Democrats elected to Congress. So that was Donald Trump's message to Americans. What is your message to hopeful Democrats who are looking to flip the House today? How confident are you feeling about that prospect?
Well, our message is that we can have people who are leaders across the country who are going to govern, who are going to move our country forward, who have policy ideas to move us forward, who are going to build an economy that works for everyone, protect reproductive freedom across the country. We hear nothing but chaos and dysfunction and the extremism from the Republican side. And in the House, Republicans have been in charge and they've been incapable of governing. So people want to see governance work in these important districts all across the country. We have great candidates. We have the resources to get their message out. We've been talking to voters, and all of that is a great reason why we'll take back the majority.
Congresswoman, it's great to have you back on Bloomberg TV and radio. Happy Election Day. I know you've been living on the road and not sleeping a lot as part of your charge to get Democrats elected to the House. And so I wonder if you can give a bit of a roadmap to our listeners and viewers who are going to be experiencing all of this in real time later, specifically on the East Coast, some of the bellwethers that you're going to be looking at, from the New York delegation to the couple of contested seats in Virginia, including the one that's being vacated by Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger. I also look a little bit further out into the time zones here, but for Ohio, Marcy Kaptur, the longest-serving woman in House history. Tell us where you're looking tonight for bellwethers that might answer the national question.
Well, first of all, remember that the map for the House is all over the country.
Sure is.
It's in New York and California, and in the Pacific Northwest, all the way through Alabama, Iowa and Nebraska, Arizona and Michigan. We have races everywhere. They are all unique. These House districts are all unique, and so we are going to be looking at races all across the country. We need to net 4 more seats to take back the majority in the House. That means, winning in lots of districts across the country, keeping the seats we have. But we have great candidates running in all of these seats who are talking about the issues that the American people care about. So we will obviously get results earlier in the places where polls close earlier, like Virginia or North Carolina. But I think all of our races is a little different. I think we're in a strong position, and we're going to keep looking at those across the country. But I can tell you there's been a lot of conversation recently about places like Nebraska and Iowa. There's energy on the ground. There's 3 seats right there, 2 in Iowa, 1 in Nebraska, that are part of what could put us in the majority.
Well, as we consider the prospects for the majority in states like that, Congresswoman, which Ann Seltzer poll aside, are expected to go for Republicans at the presidential level, to what extent are you reliant this evening on split ticket voting?
Well, there are many Republicans who are tired of the extremism. They don't even recognize their party anymore. And absolutely, there are women across the country who are going to stand up to defend reproductive freedom. So I think there are definitely crossover Republican voters that we're going to see in many of our districts. These are purple districts. And people want to see strong governance. They want folks who are actually going to solve problems, get work done in Washington, D.C. Those are the candidates we have, and a good reason why I think we're going to have strong support for those candidates, and another good reason why we win.
What are you hearing from your field workers, those who are in the districts, Congresswoman, about turnout so far today?
Turnout is strong. We have just seen incredible enthusiasm on the ground across the country. I was in Iowa the last couple days. Many people turning out to knock on doors, to make phone calls. These are close races. It's very, very important that we make sure every voter realizes what's at stake this election and cast their ballot. So we've seen strong energy. We see that in early voting, and we're seeing that today. All of that makes a difference because many of these races may be very close.
Well, and as we consider energy, Congresswoman, many of us during the midterms in 2022 were surprised that a red wave did not materialize, and many pointed a finger at the Dobbs decision as the reason why, the overturning of Roe v. Wade being a mobilizing factor for people across the country and women especially. Do you think that is being adequately reflected in the polling we're looking at in all parts of the ballot, from the presidential race down to the races that you are focused on? How will abortion impact the ultimate turnout we see in the result of this election?
You know, when we've seen abortion on the ballot across the country in elections since November of 2022, we've seen strong support to stand up for reproductive freedom all across the country in states like Kansas, Ohio, Virginia, Wisconsin. And so we are going to continue to see that today. If you look at Iowa, for example, they have a very harsh abortion ban in place, and that's been a very motivating factor for voters to turn out. We've seen women turning out in great numbers across the country too. So absolutely, this has been an important issue and will continue to be an important issue because people are going to stand up for our rights and our freedoms, for our democracy, and for our future. Make sure we have a strong future for everyone in our country, building a strong economy. All of those are critically important, and voters are paying attention. They've seen Republicans change with their stances, try to twist their words, but they know where Republicans stand. They want to put in place a national abortion ban, and they're going to stand against that.
More broadly, though, Congresswoman, we talk so much about the presidential election through, yes, 7 swing states, but nationally, when it comes to issues, economy, abortion, border, is it different when you come to House races? How local and how granular are the issues that are driving these decisions?
Well, I can tell you the economy is a top issue in House races across the country, and folks want people who are going to govern. They've seen the chaos and dysfunction from Republicans putting us on the brink of a default, on the brink of shutdowns. Next year will be an important year for tax policy, and having sound leaders who are actually going to find solutions, move us forward is very critical. Important policies that help working families, like the expanded child tax credit, making sure that we're supporting affordable housing across the country. These are policies that Democrats have been pushing for. In fact, affordable housing can be a bipartisan policy, but Republicans don't seem interested in actually passing anything. So that's why having leaders who are focused on getting things done, making sure that we get policy through the House, through the Senate, and to the president's desk are critical to actually making a difference for our communities. Those are the folks who are running in these swing districts, our candidates, folks who are independent-minded, are pragmatic, want to make progress for our communities and our country. And when we have a Democratic House, we have the opportunity to get that done. And of course, I think we'll be doing that in conjunction with President Harris.
All right, Congresswoman, thank you so much. Happy Election Day, and thanks for being back with us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Susan Del Bene chairs the DCCC, and that's a busy person right there, Kaylee, leading up to this moment and potentially beyond it. You know, we talked about the matter of abortion as an issue. This did come up when reporters were talking with Donald Trump when he voted this morning. That referendum down there is a pretty big deal. He did not answer the question when first asked. Pressed a second time, Donald Trump said to the reporter, quote, "You should stop talking about it," unquote. We do not know how he came down on that issue.
Yeah, and of course, that is not the only ballot measure we are watching in Florida this evening. There's also one around the legalization of marijuana. And this is true across a number of states. Well, we have talked at length over the last 2 hours about the presidency, the balance of the House and the Senate. There are other decisions that will be made by voters as they head to the polls today, as they have already done in the numbers of tens of millions, if not over 100 million at this point.
Interestingly, Donald Trump said he would actually vote for the legalization of marijuana through that ballot measure as long as public consumption was controlled somehow, but was not in favor of locking people up for cannabis violations. In this case, for the abortion measure, he has said both. At one point, he said he supported it, then later said he would vote against it.
Yeah, and we'll see what kind of driver abortion on the ballot in 10 states. The abortion issue as a whole is for turnout today, as we continue to watch the numbers we're getting from many states, which saw record turnout at the very beginning of voting. And of course, many Americans already voting early. We have hours still to go on this election day.
You've still got a chance to vote, and join us back here at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, a special 2-hour election show right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I will show you how to get the best funding for your startup idea. Let's get started. Here's the deal. If you have an amazing startup idea and need funds to fuel it, we're here to help. Simply send us a video where you explain your idea. Make it clear, concise, and compelling. Hook us in with your passion and vision. Don't forget to include your contact details so investors can reach out directly. This is your chance to shine and get your idea in front of people who can make it a reality. Imagine turning your startup dream into a thriving business. It all starts with that one simple step. So what are you waiting for? Grab your phone, hit record, and let your idea fly. The future of your startup could be just one video away. Remember, be clear, be passionate, and most importantly, be you. We can't wait to see what you've got. Let's get funded now.
This can carry up to 20 people, and it can also transport goods. So you can configure it for goods transport within a city or transport of up to 20 people at a time. So this is gonna, the Robovan is what's gonna solve for high density. So if you want to take a sports team somewhere, or you're looking to really get the cost of travel down to, I don't know, 5-10 cents a mile, then you can use the Robovan. Some people call it the Robovan, but so yeah. You know, one of the things that we want to do, and we've seen this with the Cybertruck, is we want to change the look of the roads. You know, the future should look like the future. So, speaking of robots, so everything we've developed for our cars, the batteries, power electronics, the advanced motors, gearboxes, the software, the AI inference computer, it all actually applies to a humanoid robot. So the same techniques, it's just a robot with arms and legs instead of a robot with wheels. And we've made a lot of progress with Optimus. And as you can see, we started up with someone in a robot suit, sort of down, and then we've progressed dramatically year after year. So if you extrapolate this, you're really going to have something spectacular, something that anyone could own. So you could have your own personal R2-D2 C-3PO. And I think at scale, this would cost something like, I don't know, $20,000, $30,000. Probably less than a car, is my prediction long term. Now, it'll take us a minute to get to the long term, but fundamentally at scale, the Optimus robot, you should be able to buy an Optimus robot for, I think, probably $20,000 to $30,000 long term. So, and what can it do? It'll basically do anything you want. So it can be a teacher, babysit your kids. It can walk your dog, mow your lawn, get the groceries, just be your friend, serve drinks. Whatever you can think of, it will do.
And our election, our team reporting, and Eurasia Group's Ian Bremmer on the U.S.'s role in the world and how it may be about to change forever.
All right, folks, let's get to the trade on this Election Day Tuesday. For that, we turn things over to Charlie Kellett.
All right, thank you very much. Keep it locked into Bloomberg because you got a front row to history today. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all pushing higher right now. 1% gain on the S&P, up 57.69 where we stand right now. Dow Jones Industrial Average also advancing up 369 right now for the Dow, gain of 0.9%. NASDAQ up 223, a gain there of 1.2%. Your 10-year, 4.31% this election day. The 2-year, 4.20%. Spot gold up $4.50, up 0.2%, 27.40 the ounce. And West Texas Intermediate crude oil, WTI up 0.2%, 71.62 a barrel. Earnings, Palantir Technologies reporting quarterly revenue that beat analyst estimates, also raising its forecast for operating income in the current period. That stock surging now by almost 23%. Other news today, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has dismissed his popular defense minister in a surprise announcement that came as the country is embroiled in wars on multiple fronts across the region. Again, recapping, a 58-point jump right now for the S&P 500 index, higher now by just about 1%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much again. Bloomberg Business Week on this Election Day Tuesday. And folks, there are wild cards aplenty in this U.S. race. One of the biggest is just what impact population changes will have on the vote in key battlegrounds. Bloomberg recently dove into the data for North Carolina specifically. What emerged explains why a once reliably Republican state is up for grabs in 2024. This year, with polls showing Donald Trump and Kamala Harris in a dead heat. That was about 1 week from today. So very, very close race, as we know.
Well, with more on one of the key battleground states, to Raleigh, North Carolina, we go, where Bloomberg News correspondent Anna Edgerton is there. She's in North Carolina. A reminder, 16 electoral votes are up for grabs. Anna, you are from North Carolina. You're an editor and reporter covering U.S. Congress. You've reported on U.S. national security. What do we need to understand? What does the rest of the country need to understand about the vote in the state, the composition of voters, and how it's changed in recent years?
Yeah, you're absolutely right that this is a state that's changed a lot since the last election in 2020. We've seen hundreds of thousands of people move to the state in the past 4 years, and this is really going to be the first test of how those voters are going to cast their ballots. A lot of them have registered as unaffiliated, which makes it really hard to read into things like early voting polls, and we just don't have that data yet, but we will by the end of the night. And the places to really watch are those suburban counties around cities like Raleigh and Charlotte. This is where a lot of these newcomers have moved, and the question now is whether those counties are going to vote more like the rural counties they used to be or more like the suburban counties that they're quickly becoming.
Hey, Anna, what about the devastation from the recent hurricane? We've been thinking about that a lot, certainly about those individuals and the tragedies that many of them had to deal with, but I'm just curious about how that potentially could or could not impact the vote.
Yeah, so far it hasn't actually impacted turnout. I think people are really resolved to get out, to make their voices heard. Of the 25 counties that were impacted by Hurricane Helene, only 3 of them cast early votes at a rate lower than the state average. 57% of people across the state voted in early voting, and in the 25 counties that were impacted, 59% of people cast their votes early. So far turnout's been really strong. We'll see what happens today, but I think you really see a resolve of people to get out there and make sure they participate in the democratic process.
Well, what have you seen as you've been on the ground back in your home state? Are people lines at the polls? What's going on at polling places, given that so many people did vote early? No lines, no crowds, what's going on?
Yeah, lines haven't been too bad. People are going in, going out pretty quickly. I talked to some Republican strategists, and there's 2 things that they are really, they really give them hope. One is a strong early voting turnout from Republicans, but the question is whether or not those are people who would have turned out today and just cast their vote early, or if those are new voters for Donald Trump. The other thing is the polls that we saw last week leading up to the election that showed Donald Trump very slightly within the margin of error ahead in North Carolina. Democrats are really taking hope in the enthusiasm that they see here in North Carolina. They've had 45,000 people sign up to volunteer for Kamala Harris's campaign since she became the candidate. And yesterday they said they've knocked on 1.7 million doors. I just talked to one of those volunteers. She's still out there trying to get people to get out and vote, making sure that they earn every single vote for Kamala Harris.
Hey, listen, it is so much about the presidential vote, no doubt about it. But what about those down ballot races? What about the gubernatorial race in North Carolina?
We have some interesting ones here in North Carolina. We have Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson, the Republican, facing the current Attorney General Josh Stein. They're in the gubernatorial race. Mark Robinson has received national attention for his allegedly racist and misogynistic remarks that he has both said in public and also that he posted in an online porn forum more than a decade ago. And then you have Josh Stein, who's really run a centrist campaign, I think has earned a lot of support from Republicans here in the state that don't want to support Mark Robinson. There are a few other interesting races down ballot. The school superintendent race, also really interesting. You have a very MAGA, conspiracy theorist candidate who was at the January 6th rally, continues to post stuff on social media, facing the former superintendent of Guilford County Public Schools. So you have very different race there, and we'll see how those end up playing out down ballot.
Anna, what can we expect as far as after polls close, when the tallying will end, when we'll have an answer to who wins North Carolina?
Yeah, I just spoke with Karen Benson-Bell. She's the executive director of the North Carolina Board of Elections, and she said that in the last presidential election, we had the results. We had 98% of the votes counted by about 12:30 into the next morning. So that's their goal. But she did caution that only 98% of votes will be counted tonight, that there'll still be 2% of votes outstanding. Those are from military, from citizens living overseas. And if the election is not close, networks are going to make a call in North Carolina tonight. She cautioned that that's not an official result. The official result is going to take about 10 days because they do a pretty extensive auditing process. And she invited people who are concerned about the security of elections to come and watch that process, participate in meetings. They're trying to make this as transparent as possible to really give people faith in the process of counting votes here.
You know, Anna, we set you up. I mean, you understand the workings certainly of U.S. politics, covering Congress as an editor, as a reporter, have seen a lot of political races. Just one final question, one thought about what you're thinking about, what's top of mind for you as you're there on the ground at one of the, the key battleground states, but what is kind of top of mind for you here?
I mean, we're always looking to the day after the election, whatever the result. I hope that it's one that is accepted, by most people in the country. I was at the Trump rally yesterday, and I talked to a lot of people. I mean, between our team here, we probably talked to a dozen people heading into that rally, and not a single one of them recognized the results from the 2020 election. None of them recognized that Joe Biden had actually, in fact, won that election. So, we're hearing a lot of we'll recognize the results if Trump wins. We'll see what happens. Hopefully election officials are doing everything they can to make sure people understand the process, the pre-buttles to get in front of misinformation, and they're really putting in the work ahead of time to try to give people as much confidence as possible.
Totally understand, and you guys too putting in all the work as you cover this, and we know it could go into the wee hours as many expect. Anna, thank you so much. Anna Edgerton, correspondent at Bloomberg News, right there on the ground in Raleigh, North Carolina. We understand how this vote, obviously very important to U.S. citizens across the country, really important domestically, and yet the world too is getting ready for either a Donald Trump or a Kamala Harris victory. And that's where we go now. We know both candidates have voiced different views on the role of the U.S. globally. As a reminder, here's Donald Trump and Kamala Harris on the Israel-Hamas war during the September 10th ABC News debate.
She hates Israel. If she's president, I believe that Israel will not exist within 2 years from now. And I've been pretty good at predictions, and I hope I'm wrong about that one.
But the one thing I will assure you always, I will always give Israel the ability to defend itself, in particular as it relates to Iran and any threat that Iran and its proxies pose to Israel. But we must have a two-state solution.
That was both candidates at their one and only presidential debate. A reminder, it was hosted by ABC News back in September. All right, so Tim, our own team out with one of the most read stories on the Bloomberg today. It's also the Bloomberg Big Take, which means our editorial team thinks it is a must-read for folks out there. The story reports that the world is fixated on the result of today's vote. Even if Washington doesn't call the shots anymore, it still calls plenty. So let's get into it with Bloomberg Economics senior geoeconomic analyst Gerard DePippo. He joins us from our Washington, D.C. bureau. Gerard, you and your colleagues, you're reporting, you note, America's brief heyday as the world's lone superpower is history, no matter who wins.
But the world is fixated on the result of Tuesday's vote. Even if Washington doesn't call the shots anymore, it still calls plenty. So the outcome, no matter what, let's get to this first of all, means a different role for the United States going forward globally?
Yes, I mean, part of this are longstanding trends, but if you look at what's happening in the Middle East and especially what's happening in Europe, some trade-offs, particularly with U.S. defense in the Pacific, it's not what it used to be. So it went from the 90s and 2000s when the U.S. was the global hegemon. That is no longer the case. And even if the U.S. technically might have the resources to do certain things, there doesn't seem to be much political will. So even if Harris, for example, supports Ukraine, it's not obvious that even if she wins, that the Senate, if the Republicans control it, would authorize another batch of aid for Ukraine. So ultimately, there are limits to what the U.S. is willing to do. And so it's causing leaders in capitals, particularly in the G7, to wake up to the possibility that maybe the U.S. won't always be there.
What does that mean if the U.S. isn't always there?
Well, I think you have to break it down by region. So take Europe, for example. Europe and NATO has relied on the U.S. defensive umbrella for decades. The U.S. has been calling on them to spend more on defense. They haven't really done so. But if Donald Trump wins, he's much more skeptical about alliances than Harris is, and much more vocal about demanding our allies spend more on defense. So, for example, if Europe tried to match U.S. defense expenditures as a share of its GDP, it would increase Europe's debt by close to $3 trillion in about a decade, right? So this is a big difference in trajectory if the Europeans don't believe that the U.S. is necessarily there to backstop them. If you look at other parts of the world, say, let's take the Middle East, it's more complicated. You just showed the clip during the debate. Actually, in that case, Harris and Trump are not all that far apart. Harris is probably more concerned about humanitarian issues in the Middle East, particularly with Gaza, but they're both quite supportive of Israel. I think the difference is what we're seeing of late, particularly with the conflict with Iran, the U.S. has its limits, and so the Biden administration is doing a lot to try to somehow direct what Israel is doing, but it doesn't control it, right? And so I think people had just made assumptions that the U.S. was sort of calling the shots, and it wasn't really true before, but it's just more evident that it's not true now.
Is it a mistake to think Kamala Harris, Gerard, is just Biden 2.0 when it comes to the world stage?
That's not quite right. So there would be mostly consistency. She's of a different generation. So Biden is very much of the post-World War II order of the U.S. as the world leader, very much committed to that architecture. I think Harris is, but she has, it seems like, a more sort of modest view of what the U.S. can do, which is just more current given those limitations. There's also the fact that because she might be dealing with a Congress that might not be aligned with her, there's only so much she can do in terms of things that require more resources. And the U.S. is facing its own interest rate and debt problems now. So even if she's sort of broadly supportive, it doesn't mean it's going to be a continuation of sort of a strong U.S. policy. And even then, the Biden administration has been, as noted in an article, more or less serving its own interests, right? They talk a lot about alliances, but it's what the U.S. views as in its own best interest.
You know, you mentioned Congress, and obviously we're focused on the presidential outcome, but we are also talking a lot about the down ballot races and what happens in terms of the composition of the U.S. Congress on the other side of this vote. Talk to us a little bit more about that, how important that is in terms of shaping the U.S. role on the world stage.
So generally speaking, foreign policy is an area where the White House has a lot of autonomy. What you need Congress for is basically budgets and taxation. And if you need something for, say, more defense expenditures, or if she has, foreign aid objectives, that's where the congressional collaboration matters more. However, Congress over the past few decades, really 50 years or so, has delegated its taxation authority when it comes to tariffs. So in that case, if Donald Trump wins, he can actually pretty much uniformly impose tariffs if he wants to, using emergency powers. And so it's really on the external side, despite that this election is primarily about domestic issues.